Silence. Silence is one of the most underestimated yet devastatingly powerful psychological weapons. In a world addicted to noise, chatter, and constant validation, silence cuts sharper than any insult, louder than any shout, and heavier than any word could ever be. It is the pause that unsettles, the emptiness that forces the other person to face themselves, their insecurities, and the truth they may be trying to avoid. Humans are uncomfortable with silence because it strips away distraction and leaves only raw presence. When someone expects a reaction and you give them nothing, it feels like standing under a spotlight with no escape. In arguments, silence shifts the balance of power instantly. Instead of feeding the fire with defensive words or desperate explanations, withholding your voice makes the other person scramble to fill the void. They begin over-explaining, doubting themselves, revealing more than they intended, all because they cannot bear the crushing weight of your quiet. Silence forces reflection, and reflection is often more terrifying than confrontation. In negotiation, silence is the ultimate weapon of control. By saying nothing after an offer or a statement, you create unbearable tension. The other side, desperate to escape the discomfort, rushes to compromise, sweeten the deal, or expose their true limits. Your silence pulls the truth out of them without you ever having to push. But silence is not only a tool for dominance, it is also a mirror. When you withhold your words, people are left to project their own fears, guilt, and desires into that space. Silence makes them hear the loudest voice of all, the one inside their own head. Eye contact dominance. Eye contact dominance is a psychological weapon that can disarm, intimidate, and captivate without a single word being spoken. The human brain is wired to treat eye contact as a sign of attention, power, and truth, which is why it feels so unsettling when someone holds your gaze longer than expected. It penetrates defenses, bypasses distractions, and forces the other person to confront your presence directly. When you lock eyes with someone and refuse to break away first, you send an unspoken message. I am in control here. In conversations, dominant eye contact disrupts the balance of comfort. Most people glance away instinctively to relieve the tension, but if you hold steady, you gain psychological ground. They begin to feel exposed, as though their thoughts and insecurities are being pulled to the surface, even if you never say a word. The longer you sustain that gaze, the more they struggle to maintain composure. Their heart rate quickens, their voice may falter, and they start second-guessing themselves, all while you remain unmoved. Eye contact dominance is also a tool of seduction. A deep, unwavering gaze can create a sense of intimacy that words cannot match. It plants the feeling of being seen, understood, and desired on a level that bypasses rational thought, but just as easily, it can be used to instill fear, doubt, and unease. The true weapon lies in control. Breaking eye contact first surrenders power. Holding it asserts authority. In every confrontation, negotiation, or attraction, the eyes become a battlefield, and the one who dominates eye contact controls the unspoken war. Cold reading. Cold reading is a psychological weapon that allows you to make people feel as though you can see straight into their soul, even when you know nothing about them at all. It is the art of extracting information while making it appear as if you already had the knowledge, a skill that blurs the line between intuition and manipulation. People desperately want to be understood, and cold reading exploits that hunger by feeding them fragments of truth wrapped in suggestion, leaving them awestruck at how accurately you know them. At its core, cold reading works by weaving vague statements, educated guesses, and subtle observations into a tapestry of personalized insight. A simple glance at someone's clothing, posture, or mannerisms can provide more than enough clues. When you say, "You're the kind of person who cares what others think, but sometimes feels exhausted by it," Nearly anyone will nod because the statement resonates with a universal human experience, yet the target feels singled out, believing you saw a hidden truth within them. The genius of cold reading lies in its ability to turn generalities into precision. By watching how someone reacts, whether their eyes widen, their breath quickens, or they give the smallest nod, you can adjust and refine your statements until they seem impossibly accurate. The person you're speaking to does half the work, feeding you subtle confirmations while believing you're pulling secrets from thin air. Cold reading creates fascination, trust, and vulnerability in its victims. It convinces them you hold rare insight into who they are, making them more open, more pliable, and more likely to follow your lead. It is not mind reading, but when mastered, it feels exactly like it. Anchoring. Anchoring is a psychological weapon that seizes control of perception by planting a reference point in someone's mind and making it the foundation for every decision they make afterward. It is the silent force that dictates how people judge value, importance, and even truth, without them realizing they've been manipulated. The first number, idea, or impression you expose someone to becomes the anchor, and everything that follows is measured against it, no matter how irrational that comparison may be. In negotiations, anchoring is lethal. If you throw out a high price before your opponent speaks, their counteroffer almost always revolves around that figure, even if it's outrageous. Their brain has latched onto your anchor, and suddenly anything lower feels like a concession, when in reality, it may still be far above what they were prepared to give. This tactic bends the framework of the discussion before it even begins. Anchoring also works in everyday life. If someone hears that a certain product usually sells for $500 and then sees it offered for $300, they feel like they've discovered a bargain, even if the item is only worth $100. The anchor corrupts their judgment, replacing objective analysis with emotional relief at paying less. But anchoring is not only about numbers. It shapes emotions, beliefs, and identities. Tell someone early on that they are strong, disciplined, or exceptional, and they begin to measure themselves against that anchor, striving to live up to it. Suggest they are careless or weak, and that too becomes the standard they unconsciously reinforce. Anchoring hijacks the mind, not by force, but by planting the first seed and making it impossible to think outside its shadow. Mirroring. Mirroring is a psychological weapon that forges instant connection by reflecting another person's behavior back at them, creating the illusion of deep understanding and trust. At its heart, it is the subtle act of imitating someone's body language, speech rhythm, or emotional state in a way that feels natural and unforced. When done correctly, it bypasses conscious awareness and strikes directly at the subconscious, where humans are wired to feel safest around those who resemble themselves. In conversation, mirroring can be as simple as leaning forward when the other person leans in, matching their tone of voice, or adopting their choice of words. These small acts trigger familiarity, signaling to their brain that you are like them, someone they can trust and open up to. The effect is so powerful that even strangers can feel a sense of rapport within minutes, believing they've discovered a kindred spirit. Mirroring also works on an emotional level. If someone shares excitement, reflecting their enthusiasm validates them and strengthens the bond instantly. If they express pain, frustration, or sadness, mirroring those emotions conveys empathy without needing to force words. Humans crave validation, and mirroring delivers it in the purest form possible, making the other person feel seen and understood. The darker edge of mirroring lies in its manipulative potential. Con artists, seducers, and master persuaders use it to build rapid trust, only to exploit it later. Victims believe they've found someone who truly gets them, unaware that their own behaviors and emotions are being used as a blueprint for control. Mirroring is disarming, magnetic, and dangerously effective. It allows you to step inside someone's psychological world, making them drop their guard and open the doors you choose to walk through. Negging. Negging is a psychological weapon that disguises itself as humor, wit, or casual teasing, but its real purpose is far darker: to destabilize self-esteem and create a craving for validation. It works by delivering backhanded compliments or subtle insults that confuse the target, leaving them questioning themselves while simultaneously seeking approval from the very person who undermined them. At its core, negging is a manipulation tactic designed to shift power, pulling someone down just enough so they look upward to you. When someone is negged, they are caught in an emotional trap. A phrase like, "You're pretty for someone who doesn't try too hard," may sound playful on the surface, but underneath it plants insecurity, implying they are not truly attractive without conditions. The brain, desperate to resolve this subtle wound, pushes the person to win back acceptance. They laugh it off, they lean in, they try harder, all while not realizing the psychological strings being pulled. Negging is often used in dating and social dynamics because it exploits one of the most primal human needs, the need to feel valued. By striking at confidence and then dangling intermittent approval, manipulators make their targets chase after their respect. The cycle creates dependency. Criticism, mixed with crumbs of validation, keeps people hooked like an addict searching for their next high. What makes negging so dangerous is its invisibility. It often hides under charm, sarcasm, or just kidding, but its effects are deeply felt, eroding self-worth while tightening the manipulator's grip. It is not simply a remark, it is a seed planted in the mind, designed to grow into doubt and submission. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is one of the most insidious psychological weapons, a slow and deliberate twisting of reality designed to make someone doubt their own mind. It is not about outright lies alone. It is about planting seeds of confusion until the victim can no longer tell what is real, what is imagined, and whether they can even trust themselves. The torment lies in subtlety, small denials, quiet contradictions, selective memory, and calculated misdirection that wear away at a person's sense of certainty until they begin to surrender their perception of truth to the manipulator. At first, gaslighting feels like harmless disagreement. Someone insists you remembered wrong, that you overreacted, that you're imagining things. But repeated often enough with unwavering confidence, these denials take root. You replay events in your mind, questioning your memory, your emotions, your logic. What was once clear becomes blurry. And the moment you begin to second-guess yourself, the gaslighter tightens their grip. The weapon is devastating because it exploits the deepest human need, to trust one's own judgment. When that trust is broken, people cling desperately to whoever seems more certain. The gaslighter becomes the anchor of reality, positioning themselves as the one voice of reason amid the chaos they've manufactured. Victims often apologize, shrink, and reshape themselves, convinced that the problem lies within them, rather than in the deception inflicted upon them. Gaslighting can dismantle confidence, erode identity, and enslave the mind without a single chain. It is a war fought not on the battlefield, but in perception itself, where the victim hands over their power because they no longer believe they ever had it. Reframing. Reframing is a psychological weapon that transforms reality not by changing the facts, but by altering the lens through which those facts are seen. It is the power to take a situation dripping with negativity, fear, or doubt, and twist it into something empowering, inspiring, or at times devastatingly manipulative. The same event can be tragedy or triumph, failure or lesson, rejection or redirection, all depending on the frame in which it's presented. The human mind clings to meaning. When something happens, we rush to assign it a narrative. This is good, this is bad, this means I'm winning, this means I'm losing. Reframing exploits that urge. By shifting perspective, you can make others question their assumptions, doubt their emotions, and adopt the story you feed them. If a deal falls apart, you can frame it as a disaster that proves incompetence, or as a blessing that clears the path for something better. The facts haven't changed, but the emotional impact has been rewritten. Leaders and manipulators alike weaponize reframing to bend perception. Politicians turn scandals into proof of resilience. Marketers transform overpriced products into investments, and abusers twist cruelty into love. Reframing is the alchemy of influence. It changes not the gold, but the way the gold is perceived. On a personal level, reframing can make you untouchable. When insults become fuel, when setbacks become lessons, when pain becomes a test of strength, nothing can pierce your armor. Every attempt to break you fails because you decide what story to tell about what happens to you. That story becomes reality, and whoever controls the frame controls the truth. Emotional detachment. Emotional detachment is a psychological weapon that gives you the upper hand by stripping away the one thing that drives most human behavior: emotional reactivity. While others are slaves to anger, fear, desire, and the need for validation, the emotionally detached person stands unmoved, a fortress in the storm. This calm, calculated stillness unsettles people because they expect emotional feedback to measure their own power, and when it never comes, they are left off balance, questioning themselves. In conflict, emotional detachment disarms aggression. Anger feeds on reaction, and when none is given, it burns itself out. Someone may shout, provoke, or push for a rise, but if you remain composed, they begin to feel powerless. Their words lose weight, their attempts to dominate fall flat, and frustration turns inward. Your silence, your calm, your refusal to bend, these become the sharpest weapons of all. In negotiation, emotional detachment is lethal. Most people negotiate from fear of losing the deal, fear of rejection, fear of missing out. But when you remain detached from the outcome, you radiate an aura of control. The other side senses that you cannot be pressured, that you are not desperate, and that you can walk away at any moment. This forces them into a position of weakness, often making concessions simply to win your engagement. Detachment also creates mystery. In relationships, whether personal or professional, showing too much emotional investment too quickly exposes your vulnerabilities, but remaining slightly removed, difficult to read, impossible to sway, makes others chase your approval, desperate to pierce the armor. Emotional detachment bends the power dynamic. It makes others fight for what you withhold, while you remain untouchable. Scarcity Principle. The scarcity principle is a psychological weapon that preys on one of the deepest human fears, the fear of loss. Nothing feels more urgent, more irresistible than the thought of something slipping through our fingers. When people believe an opportunity is rare, a resource is limited, or time is running out, logic crumbles and desire takes over. Scarcity doesn't just make things seem valuable, it makes them feel essential, as if missing out would be a personal disaster. Marketers and manipulators know this truth well. Only 2 left in stock. Offer ends at midnight. Last chance. These simple phrases ignite panic, bypassing rational thought and triggering primal survival instincts. Suddenly, someone who had no interest in buying feels compelled to act, not because they need the product, but because they cannot stand the idea of being excluded from it. Scarcity hijacks decision-making, turning hesitation into urgency and calm into chaos. But scarcity extends far beyond sales tactics. In relationships, withdrawing attention or making yourself less available often increases your perceived value. The harder you are to reach, the more people crave your presence. In social dynamics, limited access creates mystique. People automatically assign higher worth to what feels out of reach. This principle has the power to elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary, purely because it feels scarce. What makes the scarcity principle so devastating is its ability to override reason. It doesn't matter if the thing being chased is worthless. The mere belief that it is limited is enough to drive obsession. Scarcity does not whisper. It screams into the human psyche, if you don't act now, you'll lose forever. Authority bias. Authority bias is a psychological weapon that exploits our instinct to obey, respect, and follow those we perceive as powerful or knowledgeable. From childhood, we are conditioned to listen to teachers, doctors, leaders, and parents, people in positions of authority whose words carry weight. This conditioning lingers in adulthood, making us more likely to accept instructions, advice, or claims without question when they come from someone we view as an authority figure. It bypasses rational thought and taps directly into obedience. The power of authority bias lies in the symbols of dominance: a uniform, a title, an expensive suit, even confident body language. These triggers immediately tilt the balance of perception. When a person seems credible or important, our defenses weaken. We assume they know better. We silence the voice of doubt in our heads and defer to their judgment, even when logic whispers that something feels wrong. This bias can be used to manipulate with terrifying effectiveness. A speaker who confidently asserts expertise can sway crowds. A manager who invokes authority can silence objections. A scammer dressed as a professional can win blind trust. People often follow instructions not because the command makes sense, but because it comes from someone who should know. The appearance of authority is often enough to override critical thinking. Authority bias also works in subtler ways. A quote attributed to a famous figure carries more weight. A study mentioned by a doctor seems undeniable. Even when the authority is fabricated, the human mind instinctively bends. It is a weapon that requires no force, because people willingly hand over their power when they believe they are in the presence of someone greater. Reciprocity. Reciprocity is a psychological weapon rooted so deeply in human nature that it operates almost like a reflex. From the moment we are children, we are conditioned to give back when something is given to us. This instinct is older than civilization itself, born from the survival need to share food, shelter, and protection within tribes. And today, it still binds people in an invisible chain of obligation, one that can be pulled to influence, persuade, and control. The moment you do something for someone, no matter how small, a silent pressure grips their mind. Buy them a coffee, and they feel compelled to return the favor later. Offer them help, and they become indebted, even if they never ask for it. Reciprocity doesn't wait for logic to intervene. It strikes at the level of emotion, guilt, and social programming. People fear being labeled ungrateful or selfish, and that fear pushes them to repay, even when repayment costs them more than the original gift. This weapon is used everywhere. Salespeople hand out free samples, knowing you'll feel guilty walking away without a purchase. Manipulators give unsolicited favors so they can later demand more in return. Even in relationships, a well-timed act of kindness can bind someone to you, creating loyalty that feels voluntary but is, in truth, coerced. The brilliance of reciprocity is that it makes compliance feel like free will. Victims rarely realize they've been cornered because their own conscience becomes the enforcer. With one small act, you plant a hook inside the mind of another, and every time they think of what you gave, the weight of unseen obligation pulls them closer to your will. Foot in the door. The foot in the door technique is a psychological weapon that turns small agreements into massive compliance. It works by exploiting the human need for consistency. Once someone says yes to a minor request, they feel compelled to remain consistent with that decision, making them far more likely to say yes to a bigger demand later. It starts subtly, almost innocently, but by the time the larger ask arrives, the victim feels trapped by their own previous choices. Picture this: A stranger asks you to sign a simple petition. It takes seconds, it seems harmless, and you comply. Days later, the same cause asks for a donation. Because you already agreed before, your brain screams that saying no now would contradict your earlier support. What started as a tiny yes has now pulled you deeper into commitment. This weapon doesn't force people, it makes them convince themselves. In sales, foot in the door is everywhere. A free trial that hooks you into a paid subscription. A salesperson asking if you just have a minute, leading into a 30-minute pitch. Each tiny agreement lures you closer to the real target, bypassing resistance step by step. By the time you realize, you're already invested. The technique thrives on psychology's most dangerous trap. Once we declare something about ourselves, we go to great lengths to prove it true. If you agree to a small favor, you've already painted yourself as helpful, and rejecting the larger favor later feels like betraying that identity. Foot in the door weaponizes your own need to stay consistent. It doesn't break down the door of your defenses. It slides in quietly, wedge by wedge, until the whole doorway is wide open. Door in the face. The door in the face technique is a psychological weapon that flips rejection into compliance. It works by overwhelming someone with a request so extreme that refusal is inevitable, only to follow it with a much smaller, more reasonable demand. What happens next is a strange twist of human psychology. After saying no, people feel an unconscious need to restore balance, to appear fair and cooperative, so they say yes to the second request, even if they never intended to agree to it in the first place. This tactic is rooted in the power of contrast. When you first hit someone with something massive, "Can you lend me $1,000? Their defenses rise and they push back. But when you retreat to a smaller favor, "Okay, how about $50 then?" Suddenly, it doesn't feel so outrageous anymore. Compared to the giant requests, the smaller one feels almost generous. The person feels as though you've compromised, so they should too. The manipulation lies in this illusion of fairness. The effectiveness of the door in the face lies in our social conditioning. Humans hate appearing selfish or rigid, especially when the other side appears to be meeting them halfway. The guilt of rejecting everything creates pressure to give in to at least something. That is why skilled negotiators, salespeople, and even parents wield this technique like a blade, using initial rejection as a stepping stone toward the real goal. It's not the first ask that matters, it's the second. The first door slammed in your face is only bait. The second door, the one they feel obligated to open, is where the manipulation takes hold. This is how no becomes the pathway to yes. Strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is a psychological weapon that thrives on leaving just enough unsaid to keep others off balance, guessing and searching for meaning where none is clearly given. It is the art of speaking in riddles, half-truths, or vague statements that can be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing you to maintain control while others scramble to fill the silence with their own assumptions. The power lies not in what you say, but in what you deliberately withhold. Humans crave certainty. We want clarity, resolution, and direct answers because the unknown breeds discomfort. Strategic ambiguity weaponizes this instinct. By refusing to provide definitive statements, you create a vacuum of meaning that others rush to fill, often projecting their own fears, hopes, or insecurities onto your words. The result is that they reveal more about themselves than you ever reveal about yourself. In leadership, ambiguity can command authority. A leader who speaks in layered or cryptic ways appears wise, as though their words contain hidden depths. Subordinates interpret the message in whatever way fits their own perspective, all while the leader retains plausible deniability if things go wrong. "That's not what I meant" becomes an escape hatch, and no one can pin them down. In relationships, strategic ambiguity manipulates emotions. A vague compliment, an unclear commitment, or a cryptic message keeps the other person hooked, constantly analyzing and chasing clarity. The uncertainty becomes addictive, leaving them vulnerable to your next move. The brilliance of strategic ambiguity is that it keeps you untouchable. You reveal nothing concrete, expose no weaknesses, and yet wield influence by making others live in the discomfort of uncertainty. It is power hidden in the shadows of vagueness. Redirection. Redirection is a psychological weapon that bends the flow of attention, emotion, and thought away from danger and toward the path you choose. It is not about confrontation, but about stealth, guiding someone's focus so subtly that they never realize they've been led. Humans are easily distracted, their minds wired to chase what feels urgent or emotionally charged. Redirection seizes this weakness, pulling eyes and thoughts away from what matters most while you plant the narrative you want them to follow. In conflict, redirection can dissolve an attack without ever answering it. When someone confronts you with accusations, you don't fight the accusation head on. Instead, you pivot the conversation to a different issue, a different emotion, a different battlefield. Their anger begins to lose steam as their attention locks onto the new frame. They walk away believing they've pressed you, never realizing you never even stood in the ring. Magicians use redirection to make the impossible seem real, drawing your eyes to one hand while the other performs the trick. Manipulators do the same in life. They highlight a trivial detail, spark an emotional reaction, or dangle a new curiosity just long enough to keep you from noticing the real play happening behind the curtain. The brilliance of redirection is that it doesn't require resistance. It requires movement. By pulling focus away from the unmanageable, you not only avoid scrutiny, but also dictate what others see as important. In arguments, in persuasion, in manipulation, redirection works because people rarely question the path of their own attention. Once you control where their gaze lands, you control the story they believe. Social proof. Social proof is a psychological weapon that hijacks the human need to belong, making people abandon their own judgment in favor of the crowds. It exploits our primal fear of isolation and our deep desire to follow the tribe. When we see others doing, believing, or endorsing something, our brains instinctively label it as safe, correct, and valuable. This is why laughter spreads in a room, why products with more reviews sell faster, and why a crowded restaurant feels more trustworthy than an empty one. At its core, social proof whispers to the subconscious, if everyone else approves, you should too. It silences doubt by replacing it with conformity. In moments of uncertainty, humans default to imitation. If 10 people look up at the sky, soon dozens more will follow without even knowing why. That's not logic, it's survival wiring, programmed into us from the days when following the tribe meant life or death. Marketers and manipulators weaponize social proof constantly. Influencers flaunt millions of followers, creating the illusion of authority. Fake testimonials and manufactured reviews trick you into believing you're missing out on what everyone else already enjoys. Even cult leaders use it, packing crowds with loyal followers to make newcomers feel swept up in an unstoppable movement. The terrifying power of social proof is that it bypasses reason. When the majority points in one direction, standing alone feels unbearable. The crowd becomes the compass, even when it's wrong. And in that moment, your individuality dissolves, your resistance crumbles, and the weight of everyone else makes you surrender without realizing you've been pushed. Guilt tripping. Guilt tripping is a psychological weapon that strikes at the heart of human conscience, twisting empathy into a leash. It works by making someone feel responsible for another person's pain, disappointment, or unhappiness, forcing them to act not out of free will, but out of emotional obligation. At its core, guilt tripping manipulates the innate human desire to be seen as good, caring, and dependable, and it turns that desire into a weapon against you. The tactic often hides in subtle words or gestures, a sigh after you refuse a favor, a comment like, "I guess I just can't count on you," a reminder of past sacrifices. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." Each statement is designed to infect the mind with shame, to spark the thought that you failed someone even when you've done nothing wrong. The guilt eats away at you, and soon the easiest escape is compliance. You give in, not because you want to, but because the weight of disappointment is unbearable. What makes guilt tripping so dangerous is that it masquerades as morality. The manipulator positions themselves as the victim, while you are framed as selfish, ungrateful, or uncaring. It traps you in a moral paradox. If you resist, you're cruel. If you comply, you're controlled. Over time, guilt tripping erodes self-confidence and boundaries. You begin to question your worth, doubting whether you are ever enough. And the manipulator, feeding on this doubt, grows stronger with every concession. Guilt becomes the invisible chain, soft to the touch but impossible to break once it wraps around your conscience. Strategic pauses. Strategic pauses are a psychological weapon that transforms silence into power, turning the absence of words into a force that commands attention and bends the flow of interaction to your will. Most people rush to fill silence because it feels awkward, but the deliberate pause flips that instinct, making the other person lean in, anticipate, and sometimes crumble under the weight of what you have not yet said. The pause becomes more powerful than the speech itself because it carries tension, expectation, and authority. In conversations, a pause before answering a question makes your words feel more valuable, as though you have carefully considered what to say. The listener interprets the delay as thoughtfulness, wisdom, or confidence, even if your answer is simple. In negotiations, a pause after a proposal creates unbearable pressure. The other party begins doubting their offer, scrambling to justify it, or rushing to adjust it in your favor, simply because your silence makes them insecure. In arguments, pausing at the right moment can cut deeper than shouting ever could. When someone expects a heated reaction and you instead pause, letting silence hang heavy in the air, they are forced to wrestle with their own emotions. They replay their words, question their stance, and reveal cracks in their confidence, while you stand unshaken. The brilliance of strategic pauses lies in their unpredictability. A pause before delivering a critical point magnifies its impact. A pause after a cutting remark makes it sting twice as hard. A pause in the middle of a story draws your audience to the edge of their seats. Pauses bend time itself, making every second of silence echo louder than noise. Storytelling influence. Storytelling influence is a psychological weapon that has ruled human minds longer than any law, any army, or any government. Long before writing, before cities, before history itself, humans sat around fires and told stories. Those stories shaped beliefs, created heroes and villains, taught morality, and bound tribes together under shared myths. To this day, the brain craves narrative more than logic. A single story can move hearts, shift opinions, and command obedience in ways raw facts never could. When you tell a story, you bypass the critical mind. Instead of debating whether your argument is true, the listener imagines themselves inside your tale. Their emotions fire, their senses engage, and they begin to feel the reality you've constructed. A powerful story doesn't just inform, it infects. The listener lives it, breathes it, and carries it with them long after the words are gone. Leaders wield this weapon to inspire nations. Marketers use it to sell identities instead of products, and manipulators use it to trap people in false realities. A story of loss can stir guilt. A story of triumph can spark courage. A story of betrayal can sow paranoia. You do not need to prove your point. You need only wrap it in a narrative strong enough to eclipse doubt. The danger of storytelling influence lies in its invisibility. People rarely realize they are being persuaded, because they are too busy feeling. They drop their guard, suspend disbelief, and allow themselves to be carried. And once their emotions are seized by the current of your story, their choices soon follow. Consistency principle. The consistency principle is a psychological weapon that preys on one of the strongest human drives, the need to appear stable, reliable, and true to our past decisions. Once we commit to something, no matter how small, we feel a deep, often unconscious pressure to stay aligned with that choice, even when it no longer serves us. This craving for consistency is so powerful that it can trap people into agreements, beliefs, and behaviors they might never have accepted if asked outright. The moment you declare something publicly, it chains you. If you say you'll support a cause, follow a plan, or stick to a goal, your identity becomes intertwined with that commitment. To break it later feels like weakness, hypocrisy, or betrayal, not only to others, but to yourself. This is why salespeople, cult leaders, and manipulators exploit the consistency principle mercilessly. They don't ask for massive compliance at first. Instead, they lure you with a small yes, then watch as your own need to remain consistent drags you deeper. The consistency principle is also the silent force behind loyalty. Once people buy a brand, invest in an idea, or choose a side, they will defend it, even in the face of evidence that they were wrong. It's why political beliefs are hard to change, why consumers stick with overpriced products, and why toxic relationships endure far longer than they should. Consistency makes people predictable. Predictability makes them controllable. By pulling on this psychological thread, you don't force anyone to comply. They force themselves, shackled by their desperate need to remain the person they claim to be. Fear appeal. Fear appeal is a psychological weapon that bypasses reason and seizes the oldest, rawest part of the human brain, survival instinct. It is the art of planting fear so vividly in someone's mind that they will do almost anything to escape it. When fear takes hold, logic is silenced, critical thinking collapses, and decisions are made not from clarity, but from desperation to avoid danger. This is why fear appeal is one of the most potent tools of persuasion, manipulation, and control. The essence of fear appeal is simple: exaggerate or highlight a threat, then offer a solution that appears to eliminate it. Governments use it in propaganda, warning of enemies at the gates. Marketers wield it in slogans. Without this product, your health is at risk. Leaders, abusers, and manipulators know that by conjuring worst-case scenarios, they can corral people into compliance. Fear narrows vision, shutting out possibilities until the only path visible is the one the persuader lays out. Fear appeal works because it taps into primal wiring. Our ancestors survived by reacting instantly to danger, fight, flight, or freeze. That same wiring still governs us today. Show someone an image of death, loss, or humiliation, and their body responds before their mind can. The heartbeat races, adrenaline floods, and suddenly even irrational choices feel like survival. But fear appeal doesn't only terrify, it binds. The person delivering the warning becomes both the bringer of fear and the provider of safety. It is this duality that makes fear appeal so insidious. It doesn't just make people afraid, it makes them dependent on the very hand that frightened them. Reverse psychology. Reverse psychology is a psychological weapon that turns resistance into compliance by making people believe they are acting out of defiance when in reality they are following the path you designed for them. At its core, it manipulates the human instinct to reject control. People hate being told what to do, so when you push them in one direction, their pride and ego drive them to choose the opposite, ironically landing exactly where you wanted them all along. This technique preys on the universal craving for autonomy. By deliberately suggesting the opposite of what you truly want, you awaken a person's rebellious streak. Tell a child they probably wouldn't enjoy a certain toy, and suddenly it becomes irresistible. Tell someone they're probably not ready for a challenge, and they will bend over backwards to prove you wrong. The brilliance is that they feel in control, when in truth, their choice was engineered. Reverse psychology also thrives in relationships and negotiations. When you appear disinterested, people chase harder. When you imply they shouldn't take an opportunity, they cling to it. When you say, Bito, you don't have to agree with me, the suggestion often pushes them closer to agreement. The manipulation works because the target experiences the decision as their own victory, not your persuasion. The weapon's edge comes from its subtlety. The best use of reverse psychology doesn't feel like manipulation, it feels like freedom. And in that illusion of freedom, people march willingly into the trap you've set, convinced that they've outsmarted you, when in reality, you've outsmarted them. Triangulation. Triangulation is a psychological weapon that thrives on manipulation through division, pulling strings in the shadows while others battle in the light. At its core, triangulation is the act of introducing a third party into a relationship or conflict to create tension, insecurity, or competition. It exploits the human need for validation, forcing people to fight for attention, loyalty, or approval, while the manipulator sits comfortably in control. In toxic relationships, triangulation is the invisible dagger. A partner may subtly compare you to someone else, praising them in ways that highlight your flaws. Suddenly, you are not just seeking love, you are competing for it. Jealousy grows, self-worth diminishes, and the manipulator gains absolute power by making you believe you must constantly prove yourself. The rival, real or imagined, becomes the tool that keeps you chained to their validation. Triangulation is just as lethal in workplaces and social groups. A leader pits team members against one another, whispering different versions of the truth, creating rivalry where there should be unity. While others scramble for favor and recognition, the manipulator strengthens their position as the one everyone must please. The chaos serves their control, because when people are divided, they are far easier to rule. The brilliance of triangulation is that the manipulator never needs to attack directly. They simply seed comparisons, doubts, or whispers, then step back as emotions do the rest. The victims often fail to see the puppet master behind the curtain. Instead, they fight each other while unknowingly feeding the power of the one who set the trap. Covert contracts. Covert contracts are one of the most manipulative psychological weapons because they operate in silence, invisible to the person being targeted. At their core, they are unspoken agreements created by one party where expectations are placed on another without ever being communicated. The danger lies in the trap. One person believes they've earned something, love, loyalty, repayment, recognition, while the other remains completely unaware such a deal even existed. They often sound like this inside the manipulator's mind. If I do this for them, they'll have to do that for me. But the exchange is never spoken aloud. Instead, it festers. The manipulator gives, helps, sacrifices, and waits, building resentment each time the unspoken contract isn't fulfilled. The victim, blind to the hidden terms, is suddenly accused of betrayal, selfishness, or disloyalty. They are made to feel guilty for breaking a promise they never even made. In relationships, covert contracts poison intimacy. Someone showers their partner with favors, secretly expecting affection, sex, or constant appreciation in return. When the partner doesn't comply, they are met with anger, coldness, or manipulation. The giver paints themselves as selfless, while the reality is far more sinister. They were bargaining in the shadows. In professional life, covert contracts breed bitterness. An employee works late nights, assuming their sacrifice guarantees a raise. When none comes, they lash out at an employer who never agreed to such terms. The invisible contract collapses, leaving only disappointment and rage. Covert contracts thrive on dishonesty, not just with others but with oneself. They allow the manipulator to wear the mask of generosity while secretly keeping score, demanding repayment for debts that were never acknowledged. And when they finally cash in, the victim is left stunned, blamed, and cornered. Selective ignorance. Selective ignorance is a psychological weapon that cloaks itself in indifference but wields enormous power. It is the deliberate act of ignoring certain people, comments, or situations, not because you didn't notice them, but because you want others to feel the sting of being dismissed. Few things cut deeper than invisibility. When someone expects acknowledgement and receives silence instead, it destabilizes their confidence and forces them to question their worth, their relevance, and even their sanity. This tactic thrives on the human need for recognition. We are wired to crave responses, validation, and acknowledgement from others. A simple reply, a nod, or even a glance can affirm our existence in a social space. Selective ignorance weaponizes this need by withholding it strategically. When used in conflict, ignoring accusations or insults leaves the aggressor swinging into empty air, their anger bouncing back on themselves. In relationships, ignoring messages, calls, or emotional bids creates an aching void that the other person scrambles to fill, often bending over backward just to win back attention. The brilliance of selective ignorance is that it shifts power without a word. By refusing to engage, you place yourself above the noise, making the other person feel like they are chasing shadows. They start over-explaining, apologizing, or desperately escalating their efforts just to break through your wall of silence. But selective ignorance does more than punish. It controls. It signals that your attention is scarce and must be earned, making others value it even more. To be ignored is to feel powerless, and in that vacuum, the one who chooses ignorance becomes untouchable. Forced choice technique. The forced choice technique is a psychological weapon that manipulates freedom itself, giving the illusion of choice while stripping away true alternatives. It works by presenting two or more options, all carefully designed so that whichever path the other person selects, the outcome still benefits you. The brilliance lies in the perception of control. People feel empowered because they are choosing, yet the choice is nothing more than a cage disguised as liberty. Humans crave autonomy, and this craving makes the forced choice technique so effective. When you ask, "Would you like to start today or tomorrow?" the real trap is that you've already eliminated the option of refusal. When a parent asks a child, "Do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt?" the child feels independent, not realizing they've already been steered into compliance. It works in negotiations, in sales, in relationships, anywhere someone wants to direct behavior without triggering resistance. This weapon is especially devastating because it bypasses defensiveness. Instead of meeting a direct command with rebellion, the mind relaxes into the comfort of selection. The victim feels ownership of the decision, making them more committed to it, more confident in it, and less likely to question it later. They defend the very trap they walked into because they believe it was their choice all along. The forced choice technique doesn't need pressure or aggression. It doesn't shout or demand. It whispers, offering freedom while quietly stripping it away. And by the time someone realizes they never had a real choice, the decision has already been made and the power is no longer theirs. Vague compliments. Vague compliments are a psychological weapon disguised as flattery, powerful precisely because of their ambiguity. They slip past defenses, plant seeds of validation, and force the recipient to do the work of attaching meaning. A statement like, "You have such an interesting energy," or "There's something special about you," feels personal, yet it reveals nothing concrete. The vagueness leaves the mind restless, searching for what exactly was meant, and in that search, the compliment grows larger than it ever was. Humans crave recognition, but specific praise can be argued against. If someone says, "You're intelligent," you may question it. Am I really? What proof do they have? But when the compliment is vague, it bypasses logic. It cannot be disproven because it isn't defined. Instead, the receiver fills in the blanks with their own desires. If they want to be seen as kind, they'll believe the compliment referred to kindness. If they want to be seen as powerful, they'll interpret it that way. This weapon works because it turns flattery into a mirror. The person doesn't just hear praise, they hear the praise they want to hear. It makes them feel uniquely understood, even though nothing specific was said. Politicians, seducers, and manipulators all wield vague compliments with surgical precision, wrapping their words in mystery, so the listener becomes addicted to deciphering them. The most dangerous part of vague compliments is their ability to linger. Hours or even days later, the recipient replays the words, assigning them deeper and deeper meaning. What began as a simple phrase transforms into a powerful hook in the mind, keeping them tethered to the one who delivered it. Psychological distancing. Psychological distancing is a weapon that creates power not by closeness, but by deliberate separation. It is the art of pulling back emotionally, mentally, or socially in a way that leaves others grasping for your attention, validation, or approval. Humans crave connection, and when it is withheld, the absence screams louder than any presence. Distancing forces people to question themselves, amplifying insecurity, making them chase harder, and often surrendering control just to bridge the gap you've created. In relationships, psychological distancing is devastating. When you suddenly become less available, slower to reply, colder in tone, less emotionally engaged, the other person spirals into doubt. Did I do something wrong? Why are they pulling away? This anxiety drives them to overcompensate, to give more, to try harder, desperate to regain the intimacy you've deliberately withdrawn. The cruel paradox is that the more they give, the more powerful your distance becomes. In conflict, distancing is sharper than anger. Instead of engaging in arguments, you retreat into silence and space. Your absence becomes punishment, your lack of reaction a mirror forcing the other person to confront their guilt or powerlessness. Unlike rage, which can be matched, distancing cannot be fought. It leaves the opponent swinging at air, helpless against the void. Even in professional settings, distancing elevates authority. The leader who is rarely accessible, who keeps themselves slightly out of reach, is perceived as more important, more desirable, more powerful. Scarcity inflates value, and psychological distance manufactures scarcity without a word. This weapon thrives on one principle. People chase what they feel slipping away, and when you step back, they step forward, straight into your control. False urgency. False urgency is a psychological weapon that hijacks the mind by fabricating pressure, forcing people to act before they have the chance to think. It creates the illusion that time is running out, that hesitation means loss, and that immediate action is the only way to avoid regret. When urgency is triggered, fear and adrenaline override reason, making people leap into decisions they would never make if they paused to reflect. Marketers wield this weapon mercilessly. Only 24 hours left. Sale ends tonight. Last chance to secure your spot. These words bypass logic and dig straight into primal survival instincts, awakening the fear of missing out. Even if the deal resets tomorrow, even if the offer was never limited, the urgency feels real in the moment. People buy not because they want or need the thing, but because the thought of losing it is unbearable. But false urgency extends beyond business. Manipulators in relationships and negotiations use it to trap others into compliance. If you don't decide now, the chance is gone forever. If you walk away, I won't give you another shot. These ultimatums spark panic, clouding judgment and silencing objections. The victim, desperate not to lose, agrees without realizing the urgency was manufactured from thin air. What makes false urgency so dangerous is how it transforms ordinary choices into life or death dilemmas in the mind. It tricks people into mistaking speed for necessity, rushing into traps designed to benefit the manipulator. The clock may be fake, the deadline imaginary, but the pressure feels crushingly real, and that illusion is enough to control the outcome. Silent treatment. The silent treatment is a psychological weapon that punishes without words, a withdrawal so cold it cuts deeper than anger ever could. Unlike explosive arguments or heated debates, it strikes by withholding attention, affection, and acknowledgement, turning presence into absence and conversation into a void. It is emotional starvation, and the victim feels it like oxygen being drained from the room. Humans are wired to seek connection. When someone they value suddenly refuses to speak, ignores their existence, or acts as though they are invisible, the mind begins to panic. The victim replays every moment, every word, searching for what went wrong. The silence gnaws at their self-worth, making them question not only the relationship, but themselves. It is a cruel paradox. The more the victim longs for communication, the more powerful the silence becomes. In relationships, the silent treatment creates a suffocating imbalance of power. The one who withdraws appears calm, in control, untouchable. The one left in the silence feels small, desperate, and increasingly submissive, willing to bend or even beg just to break through the wall of quiet. In arguments, it escalates tension far more effectively than shouting because the silence leaves everything unresolved, amplifying insecurity and fear. The weapon works because it denies closure. Words can be refuted, arguments can be countered, but silence is impossible to fight. It forces the other person to collapse inward, carrying the weight of guilt, rejection, and abandonment until they crack. The silent treatment is not simply absence of speech. It is calculated presence of pain delivered without a sound. Power posing. Power posing is a psychological weapon that manipulates not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. It is the deliberate use of expansive, dominant body language, taking up space, standing tall, spreading your arms, lifting your chin, to project strength, confidence, and authority. Long before words are spoken, the body announces who holds the power, and the human brain is hardwired to respect, fear, or follow those signals. When you adopt a power pose, you send a primal message of dominance. It taps into ancient hierarchies where posture determines survival. The strong stood tall, the weak made themselves small. Even today, someone who takes up more space is subconsciously perceived as more competent, more influential, and more in control. A wide stance in a negotiation, a steady posture in an argument, or a confident stride into a room can shift the balance of power without a single word being spoken. But power posing doesn't just affect others, it alters your own psychology. By forcing the body into positions associated with confidence, the brain begins to mirror that state. Heart rate steadies, cortisol drops, testosterone rises, and suddenly you feel more powerful. This creates a self-fulfilling cycle. Your body convinces your mind fuels your behavior, and your behavior convinces everyone else. The brilliance of power posing is its simplicity. It requires no words, no arguments, no manipulation of facts, only the silent assertion of presence. In moments of doubt, adopting a strong posture can flip your state instantly. In moments of conflict, it can intimidate without aggression. Power posing is not just a display of dominance, it is the silent language of authority that the human psyche cannot ignore. Double bind tactics. Double bind tactics are a psychological weapon that traps people in an illusion of choice, where every possible option leads them exactly where you want them to go. It is manipulation wrapped in freedom, a trick of framing that convinces the target they are in control when, in truth, the outcome has already been decided. The genius of the double bind lies in how it exploits the human need for autonomy. People resist being told what to do, but when offered two or more choices, they eagerly comply, unaware that all paths were carefully constructed to benefit the manipulator. Consider the parent who asks, "Do you want to clean your room now or after dinner?" The child feels empowered by choosing, but the hidden trap is that cleaning will happen regardless. In sales, a closer may ask, "Would you like the premium package or the standard package?" The real decision, whether to buy at all, has been erased from the equation. In relationships, someone may say, "Do you want to talk about what upset you here, or when we get home?" Either choice drags the person into a conversation they never wanted to have. Double binds strike at the subconscious, where the brain registers freedom while the reality is entrapment. They are devastating because they bypass resistance. Instead of fighting outright, the target feels they've made a decision, and people are far more likely to follow through on choices they believe are their own. This tactic doesn't force compliance, it disguises it. By narrowing the frame of possibilities, double bind tactics box the target into submission while letting them smile, believing they held the reins all along. Illusion of choice. The illusion of choice is a psychological weapon that makes people believe they are in control, when in truth, every option they're given leads to the manipulator's desired outcome. It is freedom wrapped in chains, a stage play where the audience thinks they're writing the script, but the ending has already been decided. By presenting limited options, carefully framed, the manipulator creates a sense of autonomy while guiding decisions along a predetermined path. This tactic is everywhere. Parents use it with children. "Do you want to go to bed now or in 10 minutes?" The child feels empowered, yet the outcome, going to bed, is unavoidable. Salespeople perfect this trick. "Would you like the premium package or the deluxe package?" The customer feels they're choosing, but the real win is that they've already agreed to buy. In politics, corporations, and media, the illusion of choice reigns supreme, offering two sides of the same coin while hiding the fact that the coin itself was chosen for you. What makes this weapon so dangerous is how it exploits human pride. People want to feel independent, rational, and self-directed. The illusion of choice feeds that need, letting them believe they're exercising free will, while the boundaries of that freedom are quietly manipulated. The victim feels empowered in the moment, but in reality, they have walked directly into the trap designed for them. The brilliance of the illusion of choice lies not in restricting freedom outright, but in giving just enough of it to mass control. By narrowing possibilities and dressing them as freedom, manipulators control not just decisions, but the very perception of autonomy itself. Future pacing. Future pacing is a psychological weapon that plants visions of the future so vividly in someone's mind that they begin to feel and act as though it is already real. It is the art of speaking not about what is, but about what will be, guiding thoughts, emotions, and decisions by making the future feel inevitable. The human brain is wired to simulate experiences, and when a picture of tomorrow is painted with enough clarity, the subconscious starts aligning behavior to make it come true. This technique works because the mind struggles to distinguish between imagination and reality. When you tell someone, "Picture yourself closing this deal and celebrating your success tonight," their body responds with the same emotions as if it were already happening. Excitement, relief, or confidence begin to surface, and those emotions drive them closer to the very decision you want. Future pacing bypasses logic and hooks directly into desire. In persuasion, it's lethal. Salespeople use it to make clients imagine the benefits of ownership before they've bought anything. Leaders use it to rally teams by describing victories that haven't happened yet. In relationships, it forges intimacy by talking about shared futures, vacations, or milestones, pulling people emotionally deeper into connection. Future pacing also leverages fear. By painting a grim vision of what happens if someone fails to act, regret, loss, or humiliation, you bind them to the action that avoids that fate. The true power of future pacing lies in its ability to bend time. It hijacks the present moment with an imagined tomorrow, leaving the victim not just persuaded, but compelled, because they've already lived the future in their mind, and now they need reality to catch up. Persuasion. Persuasion is a psychological weapon that begins working before a single argument is made, shaping the battlefield of the mind so that persuasion becomes inevitable. It is the art of setting the stage, planting associations, and guiding focus in such a way that the target is primed to accept what comes next. Most people believe persuasion happens in the moment of decision, but persuasion works earlier, bending the subconscious long before the choice is presented. The key lies in attention. Whatever someone is focused on before your request colors how they respond to it. If you direct their mind towards safety, they will view your proposal through the lens of caution. If you steer them toward growth, they will lean toward optimism. A skilled manipulator doesn't argue harder. They adjust the frame of thought so subtly that when the message arrives, it feels like the natural conclusion. Marketers use persuasion when they show images of happy families before pitching life insurance, linking safety and love to their product. Politicians use it by repeating values like freedom or security before presenting policies, so the audience evaluates the policy as a protector of those ideals. Even in relationships, persuasion thrives. A simple reminder of shared memories or struggles makes the listener more receptive to trust and agreement. The brilliance of persuasion is its invisibility. The victim rarely notices that their attention was steered. They believe their decision was independent, when in reality, it was shaped long before the request was made. Persuasion doesn't win arguments. It makes sure the argument is already won before it even begins. Authority signaling. Authority signaling is a psychological weapon that bends perception, compelling people to trust, obey, and follow without questioning. Humans are hardwired to defer to those who appear powerful, competent, or in command, and authority signaling exploits this primal instinct. It isn't about actual knowledge or real power. It's about the performance of authority, the subtle cues that convince others you are someone to be respected, feared, or admired. Uniforms, titles, confident posture, controlled tone, and even the way someone enters a room can trigger automatic submission. A person in a suit giving commands is obeyed more readily than someone in casual clothes, even if their words are identical. People instinctively assume that status symbols, wealth, credentials, accolades mean credibility. This makes authority signaling one of the most dangerous tools of influence. It doesn't require truth, only appearance. In negotiations or leadership, signaling authority shifts the dynamic instantly. Speaking slowly and decisively, avoiding filler words, and holding steady eye contact projects control. Others begin to second-guess themselves, afraid to challenge what seems like the expert in the room. The authority signal creates a hierarchy, and once that hierarchy is set, most people fall into their place without resistance. Manipulators and con artists wield this weapon masterfully. They dress the part, adopt the language of expertise, and use confidence as camouflage. Victims obey, not because of proof, but because of the illusion of superiority radiating from the manipulator. Authority signaling doesn't demand respect. It tricks the mind into giving it. The devastating truth is that people often follow authority blindly, and when the signals are strong enough, they won't just comply. They'll defend, justify, and fight for the very figure that controls them. Status display. Status display is a psychological weapon that commands attention, respect, and compliance without a single word being spoken. It is the deliberate showcasing of power, wealth, beauty, intelligence, or influence in ways that trigger deep, primal instincts in others. Humans are hardwired to notice hierarchy, to measure themselves against those who stand above them, and to submit, consciously or not, to symbols of superiority. A well-executed status display makes others defer to you before you've even opened your mouth. The power of this weapon lies in association. Luxury cars, expensive clothing, exclusive memberships, or even the subtle confidence of posture all send unspoken messages. I am important. I have what you want. I am above you. In social settings, people instinctively gravitate toward those who radiate status because proximity feels like borrowed power. In professional settings, a simple signal of authority, a tailored suit, a commanding voice, a prestigious title can silence a room and bend it to your will. Status display thrives on psychology's strongest levers: envy, admiration, and insecurity. When others witness superiority, they feel both inspired and diminished. They want what you have. They want to be where you are. And in that hunger, they open themselves to influence. Even subtle gestures, like refusing to rush, speaking last, or remaining composed under pressure, communicate dominance in ways louder than bragging ever could. What makes status display lethal is its invisibility. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like natural hierarchy. But every signal, every detail is engineered to remind others of their place and your position above it. In this unspoken battlefield, status becomes the crown, and everyone else bows before it. Emotional mirroring. Emotional mirroring is a psychological weapon that reaches past logic and strikes directly at the heart, making people feel profoundly understood without a single explanation. It is the art of reflecting back the emotions of others, the joy, the anger, the sorrow, the excitement, so that they feel as though you are experiencing their inner world alongside them. When someone sees their emotions mirrored, they feel seen, validated, and connected in a way that is almost impossible to resist. Humans are wired for empathy. Our brains contain mirror neurons that activate when we witness another's feelings, pulling us into their experience. Emotional mirroring weaponizes this natural process, turning it into a tool of influence. If someone is excited and you match their enthusiasm, they believe you get them. If they are frustrated and you echo their tone and tension, they feel like you truly understand their struggle. That bond of shared emotion becomes a hook, making them trust, confide, and even depend on you. The potency of emotional mirroring lies in its subtlety. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't shout authority. It slips under defenses and creates an invisible bond. Therapists use it to build trust with patients. Salespeople use it to align with clients' desires. Manipulators use it to draw victims in, creating a dangerous illusion of intimacy. What makes this weapon devastating is that it bypasses reason. People don't analyze emotional resonance. They feel it, and when someone feels that you reflect their inner state perfectly, they let their guard down. In that moment, their emotions become yours to guide, to validate, and ultimately to control. Information withholding. Information withholding is a psychological weapon that thrives on scarcity and uncertainty, exploiting the fact that the human mind craves completion and clarity. When someone deliberately withholds information, they create a vacuum, and that vacuum becomes unbearable. People will obsess over what they don't know, filling in the blanks with their own fears, fantasies, or insecurities. The silence of missing details is louder than any truth, and it drives behavior more powerfully than open confrontation ever could. In relationships, information withholding is a form of control. By refusing to answer a question fully, by giving partial truths, or by leaving gaps in a story, the manipulator forces the other person to chase clarity. This makes them restless, insecure, and dependent, because the more they lack answers, the more they need the one who holds them. Withholding can be more tormenting than lies. It doesn't just mislead, it traps the victim in endless speculation. In power dynamics, leaders, negotiators, and manipulators use information withholding to maintain dominance. By controlling the flow of knowledge, they control the flow of decisions. A boss who keeps future plans vague makes employees anxious but obedient, desperate to stay in favor. A negotiator who withholds critical details keeps their opponent guessing, making mistakes, and conceding ground. The brilliance of this weapon is that it requires no action, only restraint. The less you reveal, the more others reveal in their frantic attempts to fill the silence. Withholding creates imbalance because the one who possesses knowledge possesses power, and the one left in the dark becomes captive to their own imagination. Strategic vulnerability. Strategic vulnerability is a psychological weapon that flips weakness into power. On the surface, it looks like openness, honesty, even fragility, but beneath it lies calculated influence. Humans are wired to respond to vulnerability with empathy, protection, and trust. When someone reveals a flaw, a struggle, or a wound, it disarms defenses. The listener feels closer, safer, and more inclined to open up themselves. But when vulnerability is wielded with precision, it becomes a tool not for connection, but for control. Imagine someone sharing a painful story at just the right moment. Tears in their eyes, their voice breaking, they draw you in emotionally. Suddenly, your anger softens, your suspicion fades, and you feel guilty for pushing back. What seemed like weakness is now leverage. Your guard has dropped, and they step into the space you just opened. In relationships, this can mean feigned innocence or exaggerated suffering that makes the other person feel responsible even when they are not. In negotiations, it may look like confessing a struggle or a limitation only to make the opponent lower their demands. Strategic vulnerability is powerful because it makes people underestimate you. By revealing flaws, you make yourself appear non-threatening while secretly shaping the narrative in your favor. Others rush to reassure, comfort, or even sacrifice, believing they are helping someone fragile, never realizing they are being maneuvered. This weapon thrives on timing. Too much vulnerability looks manipulative. Too little lacks effect. But when delivered at the precise moment, it becomes a silent blade, cutting deeper than aggression ever could. Strategic vulnerability doesn't beg for power. It tricks others into giving it away willingly. Inoculation Theory. Inoculation theory is a psychological weapon that shields the mind from persuasion by planting a controlled dose of opposition before the real attack ever comes. Just as a vaccine exposes the body to a weakened form of a virus so it can build immunity, inoculation introduces a person to a diluted argument, trains them to refute it, and leaves them fortified against stronger attempts later. It is defense disguised as exposure, and once it takes root, it makes the target far harder to influence. The brilliance of this weapon lies in its subtlety. When someone is warned, you might hear people say this about you, but here's why it's wrong. Their brain rehearses the counter-argument. Later, when faced with the real thing, the response feels automatic, almost instinctual. The manipulator has already scripted their resistance, giving them a sense of strength without them realizing they've been primed. Leaders, advertisers, and even cults use inoculation theory to protect their followers. By presenting weak criticisms of their ideas and dismantling them, they make their audience immune to stronger challenges. The person walks away believing they are free thinkers, when in reality, their thoughts have been preloaded with defense mechanisms. In relationships and negotiations, inoculation works just as well. By subtly preparing someone for potential objections, some people might tell you I'm too ambitious, but that's only because they can't keep up. You shape how they process criticism before it ever arrives. Inoculation theory is powerful not because it changes beliefs directly, but because it builds a shield around them. Once installed, that shield resists intrusion, leaving the mind both defended and unknowingly controlled. Repetition effect. The repetition effect is a psychological weapon that burrows into the subconscious by sheer persistence, turning the ordinary into truth, the doubtful into believable, and the forgettable into unforgettable. The human brain is not built to measure truth by evidence alone. It measures truth by familiarity. The more often an idea is repeated, the more real, comfortable, and credible it begins to feel, even if it is entirely false. This weapon is everywhere. Advertisers repeat slogans until they echo in your mind without effort. Politicians repeat phrases until the crowd chants them back like gospel. Manipulators repeat subtle suggestions until their targets accept them as self-generated thoughts. It works because the mind craves patterns, and repetition creates a rhythm that feels safe and undeniable. At first, repetition may seem obvious, even annoying, but the brain adapts quickly, lowering its resistance each time. A lie told once may spark suspicion, but a lie repeated 100 times begins to wear down doubt. A compliment spoken once feels polite, but spoken daily, it begins to feel like truth. The repetition effect doesn't argue, it conditions. Its true brilliance lies in invisibility. People rarely notice they're being manipulated by repetition because the effect disguises itself as familiarity. A repeated idea feels like something you've always known, when in reality it was planted and reinforced by design. The repetition effect is relentless because it doesn't need to persuade with logic. It simply needs to echo again and again until resistance fades, and once the words are embedded, they linger in the mind like a haunting chorus, shaping beliefs, choices, and identities without ever asking permission. Spotlight effect manipulation. Spotlight effect manipulation is a psychological weapon that exploits one of the deepest insecurities of the human mind, the belief that everyone is watching, judging, and analyzing us far more than they actually are. Most people walk through life feeling as though a spotlight is constantly shining on their every move, every mistake, every flaw. Manipulators weaponize this illusion, amplifying that inner paranoia until their target becomes self-conscious, hesitant, and easy to control. When someone triggers the spotlight effect in you, even small mistakes begin to feel catastrophic. A slip of the tongue, a nervous gesture, or a minor flaw becomes magnified in your mind, as if the entire world noticed and is silently mocking you. The manipulator feeds this insecurity by drawing subtle attention to it, planting phrases like, "Everyone saw that," or "People are probably wondering why you did that." Suddenly, your confidence collapses under the weight of imagined judgment. This tactic works because it hijacks the natural human fear of rejection and social humiliation. People are wired to avoid standing out negatively, to remain accepted by the group. When the spotlight effect is manipulated, the victim begins policing their every move, desperate to avoid shame. They become cautious, compliant, and overly focused on appearances, while the manipulator remains calm, directing the stage. The brilliance of spotlight effect manipulation is that it rarely requires direct attack. The victim does the damage themselves, spiraling into self-doubt and embarrassment without realizing the stage lights exist only in their own mind. By making someone feel as though every eye is on them, you paralyze their strength and strip them of control. Guilt by association. Guilt by association is a psychological weapon that destroys reputations, poisons trust, and manipulates perception without needing a shred of evidence. It works by tying someone to a group, an idea, or another person that carries a negative image, then letting the stain bleed onto them. The human mind is quick to connect dots, and once a link is drawn, even the faintest, it becomes nearly impossible to separate the individual from the association. This tactic thrives on our tribal wiring. Long ago, survival depended on choosing the right allies and avoiding the wrong ones. Being linked to the wrong tribe could mean danger, betrayal, or death. That instinct still lives in us today. making people recoil from anyone tied, even loosely, to something disapproved of. If a colleague is rumored to be close to someone corrupt, suspicion taints them as well. If a brand is connected to scandal, its loyal customers suddenly feel ashamed to be seen with it. Manipulators weaponize this ruthlessly. Politicians smear opponents by associating them with controversial figures or groups. In workplaces, rivals spread whispers of questionable alliances to erode credibility. Even in relationships, someone can be made to look untrustworthy simply by being connected to those perceived as toxic. The brilliance of guilt by association is that it requires no proof. The suggestion alone plants doubt deep enough to grow into conviction. Once the seed is planted, people see what they expect to see. Every action is filtered through the lens of suspicion, and even if innocence is proven, the shadow remains. Guilt by association doesn't attack directly. It contaminates, infects, and lets perception do the rest of the work. Intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a psychological weapon that binds people tighter than any chain by making rewards unpredictable. Instead of giving constant approval, affection, or praise, the manipulator delivers it sporadically, just enough to keep the other person hooked, but never enough to satisfy them. This creates a powerful addiction, one stronger than steady consistency, because the human brain craves the next hit of reward without knowing when it will come. Psychologists discovered this principle through experiments with animals. When rewards were given every time a lever was pressed, behavior eventually slowed. But when rewards came at random intervals, the animals pressed obsessively, unable to stop, driven by the hope that this time would pay off. The human mind reacts the same way. Love given one day and withheld the next. Compliments dropped unpredictably. Attention granted and then suddenly withdrawn. The unpredictability drives people into obsession, desperate to earn the next moment of approval. In relationships, intermittent reinforcement is devastating. It keeps people locked in toxic cycles, mistaking scraps of affection for proof of love. The victim convinces themselves that if they just try harder, they'll get back to the good times, not realizing the inconsistency is deliberate. In sales, marketing, and even social media, the same weapon keeps people hooked. Refreshing feeds, chasing likes, gambling on outcomes, because unpredictability fuels compulsion. What makes intermittent reinforcement so destructive is its paradox. The less predictable the reward, the more powerful its grip. The victim doesn't walk away. Instead, they cling tighter, hoping the next reward is just around the corner. In that endless waiting, control is complete. Emotional flooding. Emotional flooding is a psychological weapon that overwhelms the mind with an intensity of feeling so great that logic, reason, and composure are swept away like debris in a storm. It is the deliberate act of drowning someone in a tidal wave of emotion, anger, fear, guilt, love, or excitement, until they can no longer think clearly. In that moment of chaos, their defenses crumble and they become highly suggestible, desperate for relief, and vulnerable to influence. Humans like to believe they are rational, but emotion is the true driver of decisions. When someone is emotionally flooded, their brain shifts into survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thinking, shuts down, while the limbic system, the primal emotional brain, takes control. This creates a state where the victim can't analyze, can't reason, and can't resist. They can only react. And whoever controls the flood controls the reaction. In arguments, emotional flooding manifests as explosive anger or relentless pressure that forces the other person to shut down or submit. In persuasion, it shows up as overwhelming positivity, lavish praise, excitement, and urgency that sweeps someone into agreeing before they can process the details. In manipulation, it is fear-driven, terrifying someone with worst-case scenarios until they grasp at the manipulator's solution for safety. The cruelty of emotional flooding is that it feels inescapable. Once submerged in the torrent, the victim's only instinct is to find ground, any ground, and the manipulator decides where that ground is. It is not a battle of ideas, but of sheer force, where reason is drowned and control belongs to the one who unleashed the storm. Halo effect. The halo effect is a psychological weapon that blinds people into seeing what they want to see, not what is real. It occurs when one positive trait, such as beauty, charm, or intelligence, casts a halo over everything else about a person, making flaws invisible and weaknesses excused. The human brain is lazy. It shortcuts judgment by assuming that if someone shines in one area, they must shine in others. This illusion becomes a powerful tool for influence, persuasion, and manipulation. Attraction is one of the most common triggers of the halo effect. A physically attractive person is often automatically assumed to be trustworthy, kind, or capable, even when they've given no proof. Their looks become a shield, allowing them to win jobs, loyalty, and opportunities, while others, equally or more deserving, are overlooked. The bias is subconscious, which makes it nearly impossible for the victim of this illusion to recognize they're being manipulated. The halo effect doesn't stop at appearances. A confident speaker can make even shallow ideas sound profound. A successful leader can convince people that every decision they make must be brilliant. A small act of kindness can cause someone to overlook repeated cruelty. The glow of the halo distorts reality, making people more willing to trust, forgive, and obey. Manipulators exploit this bias relentlessly. They showcase one dazzling quality, knowing it will blind others to their flaws. The danger lies in the fact that the halo is sticky. It clings to perception, making it hard to undo even when evidence mounts. Once the glow is cast, people will fight to defend the illusion, all while the manipulator thrives in its light. Horn effect. The horn effect is a psychological weapon that distorts perception by making one negative trait overshadow everything else about a person. It is the dark twin of the halo effect. Instead of a single positive quality coloring all judgments, one flaw becomes a stain that spreads across the entire image, turning every action, every word, every gesture into further proof of weakness, incompetence, or guilt. Once this effect takes root, people stop seeing the individual. They see only the horn. Imagine meeting someone who is late to an appointment. That single act can brand them as irresponsible, careless, or unprofessional in your mind, no matter how competent they may actually be. A student who makes one foolish comment may be written off as unintelligent for the rest of the semester. A colleague who dresses poorly once may be dismissed as sloppy forever. The horn effect hijacks the brain's need for shortcuts, turning small mistakes into defining judgments. Manipulators exploit this weapon by magnifying flaws, drawing attention to a single negative detail until it consumes the target's entire identity. In politics, opponents highlight one gaffe, one scandal, one rumor, and suddenly the crowd forgets years of achievement. In personal relationships, pointing out a flaw repeatedly conditions others to view that flaw as the person's essence, erasing all nuance. The horn effect is devastating because it dehumanizes. It reduces a person to their weakest link and traps them there, unable to escape the shadow of perception. Once the horn is fixed in someone's mind, even positive traits are twisted to fit the negative narrative, and the victim, no matter how hard they fight, finds themselves defined not by who they are, but by the flaw others refuse to unsee. Labeling technique. The labeling technique is a psychological weapon that reshapes identity by assigning someone a description they begin to internalize and live up to, whether they want to or not. It works because humans are wired to seek consistency between who they believe they are and how they behave. When someone is given a label, positive or negative, the subconscious begins bending reality to align with it. The power lies not in the truth of the label, but in the fact that once spoken, it lingers like a seed in the mind. Tell a child, "You're so responsible," and they start acting more responsible to maintain that image. Tell someone, "You're difficult to work with," and they begin doubting themselves, hesitating, and eventually proving the label true. This technique can build people up or tear them down, but either way, it exerts control by framing identity. Manipulators use labeling to their advantage in persuasion and influence. A salesperson might say, "You seem like someone who knows quality," when they see it, nudging the buyer to act in line with that identity by making a purchase. In conflict, someone might say, "You're the type of person who never apologizes," triggering the other to prove them wrong by apologizing. The label becomes a psychological leash, tugging behavior in the desired direction. The danger of labeling is that it seeps into the subconscious. Even if resisted at first, repetition cements it, and soon the person carries the label as part of who they are. Words become self-fulfilling prophecies, and once a label takes hold, it doesn't just describe reality, it creates it. Strategic compliments. Strategic compliments are a psychological weapon that disguise manipulation as kindness, embedding influence within words that appear flattering on the surface, but are carefully calculated to direct behavior. Unlike genuine praise, strategic compliments are precise, targeted, and purposeful. They are designed not just to make someone feel good, but to make them act in ways that serve your goals. Humans crave recognition. A well-placed compliment feeds that hunger, lowering defenses and opening the door to trust. But when the praise highlights a specific trait, the recipient unconsciously feels compelled to live up to it. Tell someone, "You're always so reliable," and watch how they strive harder to meet deadlines. Tell them, "You're such a great listener," and they'll lean in even closer, desperate to maintain the image you painted. Compliments become invisible chains, binding people to identities you choose for them. Strategic compliments also exploit the principle of reciprocity. When someone feels admired, they instinctively want to repay the kindness, often by giving you more attention, more trust, or more compliance. This is why manipulators lace their conversations with praise. They know it breeds attachment and obligation. The potency of this weapon lies in subtlety. Overpraise feels fake, but a single thoughtful compliment delivered at the perfect moment can reshape how a person sees themselves and, more dangerously, how they act towards you. They will chase more of that validation, bending their behavior to earn it again. Strategic compliments are not simple flattery. They are hooks disguised as warmth, pulling people closer while making them believe they're simply basking in your appreciation, never realizing they're being steered. Mystery aura. Mystery aura is a psychological weapon that thrives on the human obsession with the unknown. People are naturally drawn to what they cannot fully grasp, and the less someone reveals, the more intriguing they become. A mystery aura feeds on scarcity. Scarcity of words, scarcity of details, scarcity of access, forcing others to fill the gaps with their own imagination. What they imagine is often far more compelling than the truth, which is why mystery exerts such magnetic power. When you remain unpredictable and elusive, people project their fantasies onto you. They wonder about your past, your thoughts, your desires, and in that wondering, they become hooked. The mystery doesn't just attract, it unsettles. It makes others crave answers, positioning you as someone valuable enough to obsess over. By not revealing everything, you create tension, and tension is addictive. In social dynamics, the mystery aura separates leaders from followers. The leader is not the one who overshares, who seeks validation through constant explanation. The leader is the one who leaves questions unanswered, whose silence and restraint suggest depth. This makes others lean in, chasing approval and clarity while you hold the reins of attention. Manipulators sharpen this weapon by withholding details, by speaking in fragments, by vanishing and reappearing with perfect timing. The mystery is never about deception, it is about control. The less people know, the more they chase. And in that chase, they give away their energy, their focus, and sometimes their hearts, all while you remain untouchable behind the veil of intrigue. Reverse labeling. Reverse labeling is a psychological weapon that manipulates behavior by daring someone to defy the identity you assign to them. Instead of praising or condemning directly, you give them a label they don't want to accept, and in their attempt to disprove you, they fall into the very action you desired all along. It weaponizes pride, ego, and the human need to prove oneself, making people dance to your tune while believing it was their own choice. For example, telling someone, "You probably won't want to help with this, it's not really your thing," plants a challenge. Instantly, the person feels compelled to prove you wrong, insisting they can and will help, often more enthusiastically than if you had simply asked. In negotiations, saying, "I don't think you're the type to compromise," can spark the exact opposite response as the other person scrambles to demonstrate flexibility. What appears as dismissal becomes bait, and their ego takes the hook. Reverse labeling works because humans are defensive creatures. No one wants to be boxed in or underestimated. When a label feels misaligned with their self-image, they push back, not with words, but with action. And that action often aligns perfectly with your hidden agenda. This weapon is insidious because it cloaks manipulation in flattery's opposite. Instead of inflating the ego, it provokes it. Instead of offering validation, it withholds it. And yet, the result is the same: compliance. Reverse labeling doesn't demand obedience. It tricks pride into delivering it, making people bend over backward to prove they are not who you suggested they were. Word reframing. Word reframing is a psychological weapon that transforms perception by changing the language wrapped around an experience, decision, or belief. Words are not neutral. They shape reality. By altering the way something is described, you can shift emotions, attitudes, and choices without ever touching the facts themselves. Reframing doesn't change what happens. It changes how the mind interprets it, turning defeat into growth, risk into opportunity, or danger into excitement. Consider how different it feels to hear "you failed" versus "you learned." The event is the same, but the framing dictates whether the listener feels shame or empowerment. Politicians and advertisers wield this weapon constantly. A tax isn't a burden, it's an investment in the future. A high-priced item isn't expensive, it's premium. A war isn't destruction, it's defense. By changing the wrapper of words, the manipulator changes the meaning and therefore the emotional response. In Persuasion, reframing is devastating because it hijacks the way people process choices. A negotiation framed as a loss feels unbearable, but framed as a necessary trade-off, it becomes tolerable. In relationships, reframing can make cruelty sound like care. "I only control you because I love you," forcing the victim to reinterpret abuse as affection. The brilliance of word reframing lies in its subtlety. It rarely sparks resistance because nothing real appears to have changed, yet in the mind, everything shifts. By reshaping language, you reshape thought, and once thought is controlled, behavior follows naturally. In the battle for influence, the one who frames the words doesn't just tell the story, they dictate the reality everyone else must live inside. Controlled unpredictability. Controlled unpredictability is a psychological weapon that thrives on instability, keeping others guessing, unsettled, and hooked on the need to decode your next move. It is the deliberate art of mixing consistency with sudden shifts, creating a pattern of unpredictability that denies people the comfort of certainty. When someone can't predict how you will act, whether you'll respond with warmth or coldness, generosity or withdrawal, they become trapped in a cycle of anticipation and anxiety, clinging tighter to you in search of stability you never fully grant. Humans crave predictability. Routine and consistency give us safety, while unpredictability sparks stress and heightened focus. By controlling this unpredictability, you weaponize both desire and fear. A sudden burst of kindness after cold detachment feels intoxicating, like water in a desert. A moment of silence after days of connection feels like punishment. The victim's emotions rise and crash with your rhythm, binding them to you more tightly with every swing. This technique is devastating in relationships, where the push-pull dynamic creates addiction. The brain begins releasing dopamine in response to the highs, while the lows keep the victim desperate for the next reward. It mirrors the mechanics of gambling addiction. The uncertainty itself becomes addictive. In negotiations and leadership, controlled unpredictability commands respect and fear. When people never know whether you'll be accommodating or ruthless, they tread carefully, treating you with heightened seriousness. The unpredictability keeps you untouchable, always one step beyond their expectations. The brilliance of this weapon is that it isn't chaos, it's controlled chaos. The shifts are intentional, designed to destabilize just enough to keep others on edge while ensuring you remain the only constant they can cling to. Suggestion planting. Suggestion planting is a psychological weapon that slips beneath awareness, embedding ideas into the subconscious so they feel like the listener's own thoughts. It works not by force, but by stealth, by weaving words, tone, and timing in a way that bypasses resistance. When an idea enters the mind disguised as self-discovery, it becomes nearly impossible to reject, because people fight external pressure but rarely question the voice inside their head. The brilliance of suggestion planting is its subtlety. Instead of saying, "You should do this," you might say, "I wonder what it would feel like if you tried." Or, "People like you usually find success when..." The phrasing doesn't demand compliance. It invites the target to imagine the scenario. Once imagined, the mind begins to accept it as possible, even probable. What begins as a hypothetical quietly transforms into a belief. Advertisers and hypnotists use this weapon constantly. A commercial might whisper, "You deserve better," planting the seed that their product is the missing piece. A hypnotist might say, "You may notice your body feeling lighter," guiding the subject's focus until the suggestion becomes reality. Even in everyday influence, a manipulator can plant seeds of doubt, desire, or loyalty with just a few carefully chosen words. The true danger of suggestion planting is its invisibility. The victim never feels coerced. Instead, they believe the idea came from within, which makes them defend it fiercely. Once rooted, a suggestion can grow unchecked, shaping decisions, behaviors, and even identities, all while the planter remains unseen, watching their harvest take hold in another person's mind. Persuasive silence. Persuasive silence is a psychological weapon that speaks louder than words ever could. It is the calculated pause, the deliberate withholding of response that forces the other person to fill the void with their own fears, doubts, and confessions. Humans are wired to crave resolution in conversation. Silence breaks the rhythm, creates tension, and pushes the other person to speak just to escape the discomfort. And in that rush to fill the emptiness, they often reveal far more than they intended. In arguments, persuasive silence is devastating. While others shout, accuse, or demand explanations, your refusal to engage turns their fury inward. They feel unheard, exposed, and unsettled, as if their power has been stripped away. Their words lose momentum against your stillness, and soon they begin to stumble, backtrack, or even apologize, desperate for a reaction you refuse to give. In negotiations, persuasive silence is lethal. After you state your offer, saying nothing puts unbearable pressure on the other side. The silence stretches, grows heavier, until they break it themselves by sweetening their deal, lowering their price, or giving away more than they planned. You didn't push, you didn't argue, you simply waited, and their own discomfort did the work for you. Silence also manipulates relationships. A partner's withdrawal of words during a conflict leaves the other drowning in guilt or insecurity, making them overcompensate with apologies, explanations, and concessions. The silence isn't absence, it's dominance, wielded like a blade. Persuasive silence is terrifying because it flips the natural order of communication. Instead of gaining power through speech, you gain it by holding back. The less you give, the more the other person gives away. Role reversal. Role reversal is a psychological weapon that flips the power dynamic by forcing someone to see themselves in the very position they've placed you in. It is the art of turning the mirror around, making the accuser feel accused, the manipulator feel manipulated, and the dominant suddenly feel powerless. Humans are deeply uncomfortable when their own tactics are used against them, and role reversal exploits that discomfort, breaking their certainty and leaving them scrambling for balance. In arguments, role reversal is especially lethal. When someone criticizes you unfairly and you respond by adopting their perspective, "If I said that to you, how would you feel?" You trap them in their own logic. Their words, once a weapon against you, become a cage around them. In relationships, manipulators often use guilt, blame, or control to keep others submissive. By reversing roles, even momentarily, you force them to confront the ugliness of their actions, often leaving them shocked or defensive. Negotiators and leaders wield this weapon with equal precision. By asking someone to argue from the opposite side of their stance, you destabilize their certainty, making them second-guess their own position. Role reversal doesn't just challenge beliefs, it forces empathy. It drags someone out of their comfort zone and compels them to inhabit yours. What makes role reversal powerful is its psychological sting. People rarely reflect on the harm they inflict until they are made to feel it themselves. When the roles switch, the mask slips, defenses crack, and suddenly the balance of power has shifted. The manipulator becomes the manipulated, and in that brief but piercing reversal, control is yours. Selective empathy. Selective empathy is a psychological weapon that cloaks manipulation in compassion, offering understanding only when it serves your influence and withholding it when it strengthens your control. Unlike genuine empathy, which flows freely, selective empathy is calculated. It is the art of choosing when to validate emotions and when to leave them unacknowledged, teaching others to crave your approval and molding them to depend on you for emotional safety. Humans are wired to seek connection and understanding. When you show empathy even briefly, it creates a surge of relief and trust. But when that empathy is inconsistent, sometimes present, sometimes withheld, it breeds uncertainty. The target begins working harder to earn your care, bending themselves to your expectations just to feel that fleeting validation again. In this way, selective empathy becomes less about comfort and more about control. In relationships, this weapon is devastating. You can mirror someone's pain to draw them close, then withdraw empathy to make them feel isolated and unworthy. The cycle keeps them emotionally dependent, chasing your approval like an addict chasing a fix. In persuasion, showing empathy at just the right moment creates the illusion of deep understanding, lowering defenses and opening the door to influence. Selective empathy also sharpens power in leadership and negotiations. When you display compassion only in certain situations, you condition others to value your acknowledgement above all else. They will work harder, comply faster, and remain loyal, not out of respect, but out of hunger for the rare moments when you make them feel seen. This weapon works because it gives just enough warmth to keep people attached while maintaining enough coldness to keep them desperate. It is connection weaponized. Expectation setting. Expectation setting is a psychological weapon that dictates how people experience reality before reality even arrives. Humans rarely judge events by their objective outcome. They judge them by whether those outcomes met, exceeded, or fell short of what they were led to expect. By controlling expectations, you control perception. You can turn a failure into a victory or a victory into a disappointment simply by planting the standard against which it will be measured. When you set high expectations, you create pressure. People strive harder, desperate not to fall short of the bar you've placed before them. Leaders and manipulators use this to drive performance, subtly reminding others of what's expected, so that compliance feels like duty, not choice. Conversely, by setting low expectations, you can engineer satisfaction. Delivering an average result suddenly feels extraordinary if you've framed it as unlikely or difficult. The facts haven't changed, but the perception has been rewritten. Expectation setting also manipulates relationships. A partner who constantly emphasizes how much effort they usually give creates guilt when they do the bare minimum, because the other person has been trained to expect grandeur. A boss who paints chaos as normal makes workers grateful for small moments of order. The mind clings to the frame provided, and reality is filtered through it. The genius of expectation setting is that it shapes emotion more than logic. Disappointment, relief, pride, and trust are all born from the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Whoever sets the expectation writes the script, and everyone else is left acting out their roles, unaware the ending was decided before the play even began. Negative visualization. Negative visualization is a psychological weapon that twists the mind by forcing someone to confront the pain of losing what they value most before it's even gone. It works by painting vivid mental pictures of worst-case scenarios, stripping away the illusion of security and replacing it with raw vulnerability. Humans cling to comfort, to stability, to the belief that tomorrow will look like today. Negative visualization shatters that illusion and makes people feel the weight of fear, urgency, and desperation in the present moment. Imagine telling someone to picture life without their job, their reputation, or the person they love most. In seconds, the warmth of certainty drains, replaced by panic. The brain reacts to imagined loss, almost as if it were real, releasing the same surge of anxiety, dread, and survival instinct. That imagined emptiness becomes leverage. It compels people to cling tighter, give more, and comply quicker, all to avoid the unbearable vision planted in their minds. In sales, negative visualization is ruthless. Imagine what would happen if you didn't have this insurance when disaster strikes. In relationships, it takes the form of threats or silent withdrawals that force the other person to imagine abandonment. In politics, it fuels campaigns built on fear of loss, where the vision of destruction outweighs any promise of hope. The power lies in contrast. By making someone see the nightmare, you make any alternative, any action, any choice, any surrender feel like salvation. Negative visualization doesn't just scare people, it reshapes their reality until avoidance of loss becomes their only focus. And in that desperation, they will do almost anything to make the vision go away. Social comparison. Social comparison is a psychological weapon that exploits the human tendency to measure self-worth by stacking it against others. From childhood, we are conditioned to evaluate ourselves not in isolation, but through the lens of how we rank in status, appearance, wealth, intelligence, or success compared to the people around us. This endless mental scoreboard can drive ambition, or it can destroy confidence. When weaponized, social comparison becomes a silent manipulator of emotions, choices, and identities. At its core, social comparison thrives on insecurity. Show someone a person more attractive, more successful, or more admired, and you ignite envy, doubt, and a desperate urge to catch up. Advertisers wield this relentlessly, parading images of perfect bodies, flawless lifestyles, and luxury products designed to remind you of what you lack. The implicit message is clear. You are less until you buy, change, or conform. In personal dynamics, manipulators use social comparison to assert dominance. They may praise someone else in your presence, "She's so much more focused than you," or subtly highlight where you fall short. The sting of comparison cuts deep, making you strive for their approval just to feel enough. Even silence can be loaded. Looking at another person with admiration while withholding it from you sends the same crushing message. Yet social comparison can also be engineered positively, creating loyalty and aspiration. By aligning themselves as the benchmark, manipulators make others compete for their recognition, reinforcing their status as the standard to live up to. The danger of social comparison is that it never ends. There is always someone richer, smarter, or stronger. By weaponizing this truth, the manipulator keeps you chasing a finish line you can never reach, while they remain the one holding the scoreboard. Controlled exposure. Controlled exposure is a psychological weapon that manipulates perception by carefully deciding how much of yourself, your intentions, or your resources others get to see. It is the deliberate act of revealing fragments while concealing the whole, keeping people curious, unsettled, and chasing after the parts you've withheld. By rationing access, you turn yourself into a mystery, and mystery is power. Humans are naturally drawn to what they cannot fully have. When something feels scarce or hidden, its value multiplies in the mind. By limiting your presence, your attention, or your information, you trigger obsession. People lean in, speculate, and assign greater importance to what little you've shown. They begin filling in the blanks with their own imagination, often painting you as more impressive, desirable, or intimidating than reality. In relationships, controlled exposure creates longing. By disappearing at times and returning unpredictably, you keep the other person emotionally hooked, desperate for your attention. In leadership, it creates authority. A leader who speaks less, appears less, and shares sparingly becomes larger than life, because mystery magnifies presence. In persuasion, it creates demand. By withholding details, you leave your audience craving completion, forcing them to stay engaged. The brilliance of controlled exposure is that it trains people to value every drop you give them. Instead of exhausting yourself by constantly showing up, you increase your impact by limiting it. They never get used to you, never take you for granted, because you are never fully available. This weapon works not by what you reveal, but by what you deny. You don't lose power by holding back. You gain it, because people always want more of what they cannot fully reach. Anchored emotions. Anchored emotions are a psychological weapon that turns fleeting feelings into powerful triggers, binding emotions to specific cues so they can be summoned at will. The human brain is wired to connect experiences with the emotions they generate. Smells, sounds, words, and even gestures can become anchors that transport someone back to the intensity of a moment. Once those anchors are set, they can be used to influence decisions, behavior, and loyalty without the victim realizing they're being controlled. Think of a song that makes you ache with nostalgia, or a place that instantly fills you with dread. That reaction is emotional anchoring at work, a cue paired with an emotional state fused so tightly that one sparks the other automatically. Manipulators weaponize this by deliberately creating anchors. A touch on the arm while delivering praise ties their presence to validation. A certain phrase repeated during moments of excitement binds that phrase to joy. Later, when the cue is triggered, the same emotion floods back, even if the situation doesn't deserve it. Anchored emotions can build obsession. A manipulator who links their presence with pleasure, safety, or desire becomes addictive. Conversely, they can attach fear, guilt, or shame to specific triggers, keeping their target compliant through dread. Politicians, salespeople, and abusers alike use this tactic, some to inspire loyalty, others to trap their victims in cycles of emotional dependency. The true danger of anchored emotions lies in their invisibility. People believe they are responding to the moment, when in fact they are reliving a past emotion implanted by design. By binding feeling to stimulus, manipulators gain remote control of the human heart. Time pressure. Time pressure is a psychological weapon that hijacks decision-making by suffocating people with urgency. It is the manipulation of the clock, forcing choices to be made not with clarity, but with panic. Humans are terrible at thinking under threat of running out of time. When the window narrows, the brain slips from logic into survival mode, pushing people to grab at whatever feels like relief, even if it means surrendering control or making a decision they'll later regret. Picture the salesman who warns, "This offer expires at midnight." The shopper, unsure, feels the walls closing in. The moment urgency is injected, hesitation transforms into fear of missing out, and fear of missing out becomes action. They don't want the product as much as they want to escape the anxiety of the ticking clock. Time pressure doesn't sell the product, it sells relief. In negotiations, time pressure is devastating. A deadline forces the other side to rush, cutting corners, lowering demands, and agreeing to terms they would normally resist. It shifts power to the one who waits calmly, knowing that panic will eventually drive the desperate into submission. In relationships, time pressure manifests in ultimatums. Decide now or it's over. The target is shoved into a corner where fear of loss clouds rational thought and forces compliance. The brilliance of time pressure is that it feels external, like fate or circumstance, when in reality it is often manufactured. The clock is a cage, and once someone is inside it, every second that passes tightens the grip. People don't make wise choices under time pressure. They make the choices you've prepared for them. Dominance framing. Dominance framing is a psychological weapon that seizes control of a situation by defining the narrative before anyone else has a chance to. It is the act of setting the terms, the perspective, and the language in such a way that others are forced to operate inside the boundaries you've created. Once your frame becomes the lens through which reality is viewed, everything said or done afterward bends to your authority. This weapon thrives in conversation. Imagine two people debating. One begins with, "Let's be honest, everyone here knows this approach is flawed." Instantly, the discussion is framed around proving or disproving the flaw, and the opponent is forced onto defensive ground. The manipulator hasn't just made a statement, they've defined the battleground. In arguments, dominance framing traps the other side into answering questions on your terms, leaving them reacting instead of leading. In negotiations, the power of framing is undeniable. Present an offer as a rare opportunity rather than a risky gamble, and the other side evaluates it through that lens. Label yourself as the authority in the room, and the group unconsciously accepts that hierarchy. The frame becomes reality, and those who fail to challenge it fall under its spell. Dominance framing works because humans are biased toward the first interpretation they hear. The initial frame becomes the anchor, shaping emotions and expectations before logic even engages. Once people accept the frame, they rarely question it. They live inside it. The true force of dominance framing lies not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. By deciding how the story begins, you silently dictate how it must end. Flattery as a weapon. Flattery as a weapon is the art of disguising control as admiration, showering someone with praise not to honor them, but to disarm them. Genuine compliments build connection, but weaponized flattery is calculated. It inflates egos, lowers defenses, and makes people hungry for more of the sweet words you control. The victim believes they are valued, when in truth, they are being softened for influence. Humans are wired to crave recognition. When someone tells us what we want to hear, how talented, beautiful, or intelligent we are, the brain releases dopamine, rewarding us with a surge of pleasure. This chemical high is addictive, and once hooked, people unconsciously lean toward the source of that praise. The manipulator becomes the supplier of validation, and the victim bends themselves to keep the supply flowing. The subtlety of flattery lies in its precision. Praise someone for qualities they are proud of, and they glow. Praise them for qualities they doubt, and they strive harder to prove you right. Flattery pulls at both pride and insecurity, leaving the target desperate to maintain the image you've painted. A person intoxicated by praise is far less likely to question motives, resist requests, or notice manipulation. This weapon is especially dangerous because it feels good. Unlike insults or intimidation, which spark resistance, flattery feels like a gift. Victims welcome it, unaware that each kind word is a thread weaving them into compliance. They chase approval, overlook red flags, and grant influence freely, all while believing they are simply basking in admiration. Flattery, when weaponized, doesn't just stroke the ego, it shackles it. Manufactured intrigue. Manufactured intrigue is a psychological weapon that thrives on curiosity, the most addictive hunger of the human mind. People cannot stand the itch of the unknown, and when you deliberately create gaps, mysteries, and unanswered questions, you draw them in like moths to a flame. Intrigue manipulates focus, making the other person desperate to know more, desperate to unlock the secret, desperate to get closer to the one who seems to hold the missing piece. The technique works because the brain hates unfinished stories. When someone hints at information but withholds the full picture, "I know something about you that you don't realize," or "There's more to this, but I'll explain later," the listener's imagination fills in the void, and what the imagination invents is often more powerful than any truth. They obsess, replaying the moment, trying to decode it, investing energy into unraveling a mystery you've intentionally designed. In relationships, manufactured intrigue makes you unforgettable by being slightly unpredictable, by revealing fragments but never the whole. You create a sense of depth that others can't resist exploring. In business, it makes pitches magnetic, teasing benefits without fully revealing them, sparking desire before explanation. Manipulators sharpen it even further, using secrets, half-truths, and calculated delays to keep others hooked in a loop of curiosity and pursuit. The brilliance of manufactured intrigue is that it flips the dynamic. Instead of you chasing their attention, they chase yours. Every unanswered question becomes a tether, pulling them deeper into your orbit. What begins as curiosity soon becomes obsession, and in that obsession, control is quietly secured. Cognitive overload. Cognitive overload is a psychological weapon that crushes the mind under the weight of too much information, too many options, or too many demands at once. It exploits the brain's limited processing power, overwhelming it until clarity collapses and decision-making is reduced to blind compliance or surrender. When thoughts are drowned in noise, people grasp for shortcuts, and the one holding control becomes the shortcut. Imagine sitting across from someone who fires rapid questions, floods you with data, and layers arguments so quickly you can't catch your breath. Your brain scrambles, but every time you try to hold on to one thread, another slips away. The exhaustion builds, and soon you're nodding along just to escape the chaos. Manipulators thrive in this space. They bury you in complexity until agreeing feels like the only relief. In negotiations, cognitive overload is devastating. An opponent bombards you with numbers, documents, and scenarios, knowing you can't analyze them all. While you're drowning in details, they slip their terms into the agreement, unchallenged. In sales, overwhelming the buyer with features and technical jargon pushes them into compliance, choosing the expert's recommendation rather than risk making the wrong choice. Even in personal relationships, this weapon surfaces. A partner floods you with accusations, contradictions, and emotional pleas, overwhelming your ability to respond. You stop defending yourself, not because you're guilty, but because your mind is too overloaded to keep fighting. Cognitive overload works because people fear mental paralysis. When thought becomes impossible, action feels like survival, and in that exhausted state, they hand over power willingly, simply to silence the storm in their head. Covert intimidation. Covert intimidation is a psychological weapon that doesn't roar, it whispers. Unlike overt threats, which are obvious and easy to resist, covert intimidation works in shadows, planting unease so subtle that the victim can't quite point to why they feel threatened. It is the offhand remark, the lingering stare, the calculated pause that sends a chill down the spine without ever crossing the line into open aggression. This makes it one of the most insidious tools of control because it leaves no proof, only the gnawing sense of danger. The manipulator thrives on plausible deniability. A comment like, "It would be a shame if something happened to your project," could be brushed off as casual, but the implication lands hard. A quiet laugh in response to your confidence undermines you more effectively than open ridicule, because your mind fills in the blanks, doubting itself. Even silence can carry menace when timed correctly, making the victim feel as though they've stepped into invisible crosshairs. Covert intimidation works because the human brain is hypersensitive to subtle social threats. We evolved to detect danger, not just in shouts, but in whispers, in body language, in the smallest cues that suggest harm might be near. The uncertainty is what makes it powerful. Open intimidation provokes resistance. Covert intimidation paralyzes with doubt. In workplaces, relationships, and negotiations, this tactic keeps others walking on eggshells, constantly second-guessing themselves to avoid unseen consequences. The manipulator never has to strike. The fear of what they might do is enough. Covert intimidation is power cloaked in ambiguity, and its silence cuts deeper than violence ever could. Role ambiguity. Role ambiguity is a psychological weapon that destabilizes others by blurring the boundaries of responsibility, authority, and expectation. It creates a fog where no one is certain of their place, what is required of them, or what consequences their actions will bring. This confusion breeds anxiety, dependence, and vulnerability, while the one who controls the ambiguity remains untouchable, free to shift roles at will. Humans crave structure. Clear roles provide security, knowing where you stand, what's expected, and how to succeed. When that structure is stripped away, people scramble to define it themselves, often bending toward the person who seems most confident or decisive. In relationships, role ambiguity makes partners unsure whether they are valued, committed, or secure, keeping them clinging to crumbs of clarity. In workplaces, it forces employees to constantly seek approval from leaders who deliberately refuse to set clear boundaries, ensuring loyalty through fear of stepping out of line. The brilliance of role ambiguity is that it allows you to rewrite the rules whenever it suits you. You can deny responsibility when things go wrong, claim authority when it benefits you, or demand loyalty without ever defining the terms. The shifting ground keeps others disoriented, hesitant to challenge you, and eager to win your favor in the hope of stability that never truly comes. In arguments, role ambiguity twists accountability. By refusing to clarify who is at fault, you force the other person into self-blame. In power dynamics, it makes people accept more than their share of work, guilt, or emotional burden because they can't identify where the lines are drawn. This weapon thrives in the shadows, where confusion reigns and clarity becomes a prize only you can grant. Strategic scarcity. Strategic scarcity is a psychological weapon that hijacks one of the most primal instincts of human nature. the fear of missing out. When something appears limited, whether it's time, access, or availability, its perceived value skyrockets. People are wired to chase what they believe they might lose, often more than what they truly need. Scarcity doesn't just increase desire, it creates urgency, panic, and obsession, making people act irrationally to secure what feels rare. This weapon works because scarcity taps into survival wiring. In ancient times, resources were scarce, and those who hesitated starved. Today, that same impulse is triggered when someone says, "Only a few spots left," or "This opportunity won't last." The brain floods with adrenaline, silencing logic and pushing immediate action. Suddenly, the decision isn't about value, it's about avoiding loss. Manipulators use strategic scarcity to bend behavior. A partner who withholds attention until it feels rare makes their affection priceless. A boss who dangles promotions as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities keeps employees loyal and desperate. Marketers flood us with fake countdown timers, limited editions, and exclusive access, not because the product is rare, but because the illusion of rarity drives compliance. The genius of strategic scarcity lies in how it twists perception. Abundance breeds indifference, but scarcity breeds obsession. Even if the resource isn't inherently valuable, once people believe it's running out, it becomes irresistible. This weapon doesn't just make others want what you offer, it makes them fear the emptiness of not having it. And fear is one of the strongest leashes of all. Power of questions. The power of questions is a psychological weapon that bends conversations, thoughts, and even entire belief systems without ever issuing a command. A well-crafted question bypasses resistance because it doesn't feel like control, it feels like curiosity. Yet each question carries direction, guiding the target's mind down a path they believe they are choosing, when in reality, you've already chosen it for them. Questions force focus. The moment one is asked, the brain instinctively seeks an answer. Why do you feel that way? What would happen if you didn't act now? How will you explain this to others? Each one narrows perspective, dragging attention away from alternatives and locking it onto the frame you've built. Where a statement might trigger defensiveness, a question disarms by making the person do the work themselves. In negotiations, the power of questions is lethal. Instead of demanding concessions, you ask, "Wouldn't it make more sense to meet halfway?" And the other side convinces themselves it's reasonable. In interrogation, questions unravel lies, forcing the liar to juggle details until their story collapses. In relationships, questions like, "Don't you care about us?" ignite guilt, compelling action that might never have been chosen freely. The brilliance of this weapon lies in invisibility. People rarely realize they're being steered. They mistake compliance for independent thought, not seeing that their answers are limited by the frame of the question itself. A single sentence, sharpened into a question, can redirect belief, spark doubt, or cement conviction. Questions don't just seek truth, they shape it. And when wielded deliberately, they turn the listener's own mind into the leash that controls them. Contradiction planting. Contradiction planting is a psychological weapon that destabilizes a person's certainty by quietly slipping seeds of doubt into their beliefs, statements, or decisions. It works by pointing out subtle inconsistencies, highlighting tiny cracks in logic, and suggesting conflicts that may not even exist. Until the target begins questioning themselves. Humans crave internal consistency. When contradictions are exposed, even imagined ones, the discomfort gnaws at the mind until it seeks resolution. This unease becomes the manipulator's leverage. The technique doesn't require outright confrontation. Instead, it thrives on casual observations. "Didn't you say something different last week?" Or, "That doesn't sound like what you told me earlier." Whether true or not, the suggestion itself forces the other person to pause and reflect, creating an internal tug-of-war. Suddenly, they're no longer defending their position against you, they're defending it against their own doubt. That silent battle erodes confidence, leaving them hesitant, malleable, and easier to steer. Contradiction planting is especially potent in debates and negotiations. By sprinkling subtle reminders of inconsistencies, you force your opponent onto shaky ground where every word feels like it could collapse on itself. In relationships, it creates confusion and dependence as the victim begins to rely on the manipulator for clarity about what is real or true. The brilliance of this weapon lies in its invisibility. Unlike open attack, contradiction planting doesn't look like aggression, it looks like observation. Yet each planted seed grows into hesitation, self-doubt, and disorientation. Once someone questions their own memory, words, or reasoning, they no longer stand firm. They lean toward the one who seems certain, the very person who planted the doubt. Psychological isolation. Psychological isolation is a psychological weapon that breaks people not by attacking them directly, but by cutting them off from the lifelines that keep them strong: connection, validation, and perspective. It is the deliberate act of separating someone emotionally, mentally, or socially until they feel trapped inside their own mind, with no one to turn to but the very person orchestrating their isolation. Humans are social creatures. Our confidence, sanity, and sense of reality are reinforced through interaction with others. When those connections are stripped away, self-doubt begins to fester. The victim starts questioning their worth, their memories, even their sanity, because there is no outside voice to counterbalance the manipulator's influence. In this barren state of loneliness, dependency grows like a vine, wrapping tighter around the one who controls their access to connection. In relationships, psychological isolation often begins subtly. A manipulator discourages certain friendships, criticizes family ties, or demands loyalty that excludes others. Over time, the victim's world shrinks until it revolves entirely around the abuser. In workplaces, leaders may isolate individuals by withholding information, alienating them from colleagues, or positioning them as outsiders, crushing confidence and forcing reliance on authority. The cruelty of this weapon lies in its invisibility. To the outside world, the victim may appear free, yet inside, they are walled off from every source of strength except the manipulator's approval. The silence of isolation becomes unbearable, and the victim clings to the only connection left, the one exploiting them. Psychological isolation doesn't break the body, it breaks the spirit. It dismantles resilience, piece by piece, until the isolated person is no longer a free thinker, but a prisoner of another's design. Compliance framing. Compliance framing is a psychological weapon that bends decisions by shaping how choices are presented, not by changing the choices themselves. The mind does not evaluate options objectively. It evaluates them through the frame in which they appear. By adjusting that frame, you can make resistance feel dangerous, selfish, or irrational, while compliance feels natural, safe, and even virtuous. When someone is told, "Most people in your position agree to this," the frame becomes social proof. To resist means stepping outside the group, risking judgment and exclusion. When the choice is framed as the smart thing to do or the responsible path, refusal suddenly feels like foolishness or negligence. The facts haven't changed, but the weight of the frame makes the compliant path irresistible. In negotiations, compliance framing is deadly. A manipulator might say, "Would you rather take this fair deal now or risk wasting months fighting for less?" The frame paints compliance as the rational option and resistance as reckless self-sabotage. In relationships, it can be as subtle as, "If you really cared, you'd do this for me," planting guilt into the very act of saying no. The brilliance of compliance framing is that it doesn't force, it seduces. It redefines the battlefield so that the target feels their decision is free will, when in reality, their perspective was engineered. By painting compliance as the path of wisdom, morality, or safety, and painting resistance as costly or shameful, you chain the outcome before the decision is ever made. Conversational threading. Conversational threading is a psychological weapon that transforms ordinary dialogue into a web of influence, pulling people deeper into connection while quietly steering their thoughts. At its core, it is the art of picking up fragments from what someone says and weaving them into new threads, ensuring the conversation never dies, only grows richer and more engaging. Humans fear awkward silences and crave being understood. Threading exploits both by keeping interactions alive and making you the person they can't stop talking to. The tactic is subtle. Someone mentions their job, and you ask about the challenges they face. They bring up a hobby, and you dive into how they discovered it. Each response becomes material, each word fuel for another branch of dialogue. To them, it feels like you're fascinated by their world. In reality, you're skillfully mining their words to build endless pathways of rapport. The more threads you pull, the more invested they become, often revealing intimate details without realizing how much they've given away. Conversational threading also creates psychological hooks. By looping back to something mentioned earlier, you said you love traveling. How did that start? You trigger the sense that you're truly listening, that you remember them, that you value their story. This breeds trust, intimacy, and vulnerability at alarming speed. Manipulators wield threading like a net. The target feels seen, heard, and understood, unaware that the conversation is being engineered. Each thread is a string tied around them, tightening with every response. By the time they realize, they're entangled, talking, trusting, opening up, while you sit in control, holding every string of the web you spun around them. Echo technique. The echo technique is a psychological weapon that slips beneath awareness, disarming people by reflecting their own words back to them in subtle ways. It is not about parroting. It is about weaving fragments of their language, tone, and ideas into your responses so that they feel heard, validated, and strangely drawn to you. When someone hears their own voice echoed, it triggers a powerful sense of connection, as though you are aligned with their thoughts and emotions. Humans are wired to trust similarity. We are comforted when others speak our language, not just in words, but in rhythm and cadence. The echo technique exploits this by gently mirroring key phrases or emotions, creating the illusion of deep understanding. If someone says, "I just feel so overwhelmed," and you respond with, "Overwhelmed? Yeah, it really does sound like too much," you instantly lower their defenses. They believe you get them, even if you've given nothing of yourself away. The brilliance of this weapon lies in its invisibility. Unlike overt flattery or obvious agreement, echoing feels natural, almost unnoticeable, yet it plants trust like a seed. People open up more, reveal deeper truths, and lean into the comfort of being mirrored. In sales, it makes clients feel their needs are understood. In relationships, it accelerates intimacy. In manipulation, it becomes a trap, because the more someone hears themselves reflected, the more they project connection where there may be none. The echo technique is subtle, but its effects are profound. By making others feel as though their voice matters, you guide them closer, all while keeping your true intentions hidden behind the comforting sound of their own words. False consensus. False consensus is a psychological weapon that exploits the human need to belong, tricking people into believing that everyone else already agrees with a certain idea, behavior, or belief. The mind is wired to avoid isolation. Being an outsider once meant death in tribal societies, so when we think the majority accepts something, we instinctively lean toward conforming. False consensus makes compliance feel like the safer choice and resistance feel like social suicide. This weapon works because people constantly look to others as a mirror for what is normal. If you say, "Most people support this," or "Everyone feels the same way," you create an illusion of consensus, even if it doesn't exist. The target, not wanting to appear difficult, foolish, or out of touch, begins to shift their opinion to align with the supposed majority. What begins as doubt quickly transforms into silent agreement, all because the victim believes they are the odd one out. False consensus thrives in marketing, politics, and manipulation. Advertisers proclaim, "Join the millions who already use this," while politicians assert, "The people have spoken," even when the reality is far less unanimous. In toxic relationships, a manipulator may say, "Everyone thinks you're overreacting," isolating the victim and making them doubt their own judgment. The perception of collective agreement creates crushing pressure to conform, even if the truth is the opposite. The brilliance of false consensus lies in its invisibility. The victim rarely questions the numbers because the fear of standing alone is stronger than the need for evidence. Once they accept the illusion, they silence themselves, and silence is the final victory because it makes the lie look like truth. Interruption control. Interruption control is a psychological weapon that silently asserts dominance by deciding who gets to speak, when they speak, and how long their voice carries. Conversations are battles for attention and authority, and the one who masters interruptions dictates the flow of power. Cutting someone off at the right moment can derail their confidence, steal their momentum, and force them into a submissive rhythm while letting them know, without saying it, that your voice carries more weight than theirs. The brilliance of interruption control is that it doesn't need to be aggressive. A well-timed "actually" or a raised hand can shatter someone's train of thought, leaving them fumbling to recover. Even small interjections, like sighs, laughs, or side remarks, can fracture focus and redirect attention back to you. Over time, repeated interruptions wear down the other person's authority, making them feel small, silenced, and less certain of their own words. But interruption control is more than cutting people off. It's also about restraint. Knowing when not to interrupt creates an equally powerful effect. By letting someone speak just long enough to expose weakness or over-explain themselves, then slicing in at the exact moment of vulnerability, you maximize the impact. The silence before your interruption builds tension. The interruption itself seizes command. In debates, negotiations, and even personal relationships, interruption control sets the hierarchy. The interrupter is the leader, the one who decides the pace. The interrupted becomes reactive, reduced to fighting for scraps of airtime. This dynamic reshapes conversations into arenas of dominance, where the loudest voice isn't the one that shouts, but the one that decides who is allowed to finish a sentence. Social ostracism. Social ostracism is a psychological weapon that cuts deeper than words or blows because it attacks the most primal human need, belonging. From our earliest ancestors, survival depended on the tribe. To be excluded meant danger, isolation, and often death. That ancient fear still lives inside us, which is why the cold shoulder, the whispered exclusion, or the empty silence of a group can break someone faster than direct confrontation ever could. When a person is ignored, dismissed, or pushed to the margins, their sense of identity begins to unravel. The brain reacts to social rejection the same way it reacts to physical pain, the sting of being left out, of watching others laugh together while you remain invisible, is not imagined. It is neurological torment. A person under ostracism will question themselves endlessly. What did I do wrong? Am I not good enough? Why don't they want me? This spiral of self-doubt makes them desperate to change, comply, or sacrifice just to be let back in. Manipulators weaponize ostracism ruthlessly. A partner withdraws affection, leaving the other begging to restore harmony. A workplace team quietly excludes one member, forcing them to overperform in hopes of regaining approval. Social groups use the threat of exile to enforce conformity. Step out of line, and you'll face the unbearable silence of being ignored. The cruelty of social ostracism lies in its invisibility. There are no insults, no blows, no evidence, only absence. and yet it can hollow a person out from the inside until their entire self-worth depends on crawling back into the circle that cast them out. To be unseen is to be erased, and that erasure is a weapon few can withstand. Identity appeal is a psychological weapon that bypasses logic and strikes directly at the core of who a person believes themselves to be. Instead of persuading with facts or arguments, it ties compliance to identity, making the target feel that saying yes is proof of who they are, while saying no threatens their very sense of self. Humans are desperate to protect their self-image, and this weapon exploits that desperation with ruthless efficiency. The tactic is simple yet devastating. Tell someone, "You're the kind of person who always helps their friends," and refusing your request suddenly feels like betraying their identity. Suggest, "A real leader wouldn't back down from this challenge," and the person is cornered into proving themselves through action. The manipulation doesn't live in the request itself. It lives in the invisible pressure to stay consistent with the label being imposed. Advertisers wield this constantly. Instead of saying, "Buy this eco-friendly product," they whisper, "You're the type of person who cares about the planet." Politicians use it by framing votes as reflections of patriotism, morality, or strength. In relationships, manipulators twist it into guilt. "If you really loved me, you'd do this." In every case, the victim isn't just deciding on a choice. They're deciding on who they are. What makes identity appeal so lethal is that it hijacks the most sacred part of the human psyche, the need for self-coherence. People would rather endure discomfort, loss, or even harm than shatter the image they hold of themselves. By tying action to identity, the manipulator doesn't just win compliance, they win the soul. Decoy Effect. The decoy effect is a psychological weapon that manipulates choice by introducing a carefully crafted option designed not to be chosen, but to steer decisions toward the one you want. It preys on the illusion of rational decision-making, tricking the brain into comparing options in a biased framework. By presenting a decoy, an option that is inferior to your true target, you guide people toward what feels like the smart or obvious choice, even though you engineered the outcome from the start. Humans rarely evaluate choices in isolation. We compare. If offered two options, the decision may feel difficult, but introduce a third, slightly worse than the one you want chosen, and the target suddenly feels like they're making a logical, confident decision. For example, if someone is torn between a small coffee for $3 or a large coffee for $7, the choice seems tricky. But if you add a medium coffee for $6.50, the large suddenly feels like the best deal, even if it wasn't before. The decoy has done its job, nudging them without their awareness. The brilliance of the decoy effect is that it masks manipulation as empowerment. The victim feels like they made a rational, independent decision, when in truth, they were herded like sheep toward the intended choice. This technique is used relentlessly in marketing, politics, negotiations, and even relationships, where presenting an unappealing option makes your preferred outcome shine brighter. The decoy effect is subtle, invisible, and devastatingly effective. It doesn't force, it doesn't coerce, it makes people want the very option you planted in their mind, leaving them certain they acted freely, never realizing the trap was designed from the start. Emotional triggers. Emotional triggers are a psychological weapon that strike directly at the heart, bypassing logic and reason to unleash raw, uncontrollable reactions. Every person carries invisible scars, memories, insecurities, and unresolved wounds, and when those are touched, even lightly, they explode into powerful emotions. Fear, anger, shame, guilt, desire. Each can be summoned instantly with the right words, tone, or gesture. Triggers are shortcuts to control because once someone is emotionally hijacked, they stop thinking and start reacting. The brilliance of emotional triggers lies in how personal they are. A manipulator doesn't need to break someone's walls with brute force. They only need to find the cracks. A subtle reminder of abandonment can make someone cling. A sharp hint of inadequacy can make them desperate to prove themselves. A taste of validation can make them crave more until they are addicted. With one carefully chosen phrase, "You always fail when it matters," or "You're just like them," the victim collapses into old pain, responding not to the present moment, but to ghosts of the past. Politicians exploit fear triggers to rally obedience. Advertisers exploit insecurity triggers to sell solutions. Abusers exploit shame triggers to keep victims trapped in silence. Once discovered, a person's emotional triggers become buttons that can be pressed again and again, each press yielding predictable results. The danger is that triggers feel real. The victim believes they are responding authentically, when in fact they are being puppeteered by someone who knows where to press. And the more deeply embedded the trigger, the more explosive the reaction, making it one of the most potent weapons of psychological warfare. Paradoxical requests. Paradoxical requests are a psychological weapon that twists the mind by demanding the impossible, commands that cannot be fulfilled without contradiction. They trap the target in a mental snare where any action they take proves them wrong or makes them feel powerless. The brilliance of this weapon lies in how it destabilizes thought, short-circuits logic, and forces compliance through confusion and frustration. Imagine being told, "Be spontaneous." The very act of obeying destroys the spontaneity, or being ordered, "Relax right now." The demand itself creates pressure, making relaxation impossible. These paradoxical requests scramble the brain, pulling it in two directions at once, leaving the victim feeling inadequate, flustered, and desperate to escape the trap. That desperation is where the manipulator seizes control. In relationships, paradoxical requests are used to induce guilt and compliance. If you really loved me, you'd stop trying so hard to prove it. No matter what the partner does, they lose. In leadership or authority roles, paradoxical requests assert dominance, giving orders designed not to be met, simply to remind the target of their inability to satisfy. Even therapists use paradoxical interventions strategically, asking a client to intentionally worry more, forcing them to confront the futility of their anxiety patterns. The weapon works because humans crave resolution. We hate cognitive knots. When someone imposes an impossible demand, the mind wrestles for escape, and in that turmoil, the manipulator gains leverage. Paradoxical requests don't just confuse, they corrode confidence, making the target doubt their ability to ever get it right. And once self-doubt takes hold, obedience often follows, if only to stop the torment of contradiction. Status withdrawal. Status withdrawal is a psychological weapon that manipulates the human craving for recognition, approval, and belonging by suddenly stripping it away. When someone is accustomed to your attention, praise, or respect, its absence feels like a void, a suffocating silence that gnaws at their self-worth. People don't just want status, they depend on it as proof of their value. Removing it without warning creates panic, self-doubt, and an almost desperate hunger to win it back. This weapon is most brutal in relationships and social hierarchies. A leader who praises a follower for weeks, then suddenly ignores them, forces that person into emotional overdrive, working harder to regain what was lost. A romantic partner who once showered affection, but then withdraws approval, leaves the other feeling abandoned, confused, and desperate to please. Even small gestures, a lack of acknowledgement, a refusal to celebrate, a subtle downgrade in respect, send the same piercing message: you are no longer important. Status withdrawal works because humans are wired for social survival. In ancestral tribes, being ignored or cast out was a death sentence. That primal fear still lingers today, and when status is pulled away, the brain interprets it as danger, sparking anxiety and compliance. Victims scramble to repair the connection, often bending to the manipulator's will just to feel seen again. The cruelty of this weapon is that it doesn't need words, threats, or confrontation. It thrives in absence. By simply withholding what was once freely given, validation, recognition, respect, you create an emotional vacuum so unbearable that the other person rushes to fill it, handing you control in the process. Emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is a psychological weapon that spreads feelings like wildfire, infecting everyone around with the emotions you project, whether joy, rage, fear, or despair. It works because humans are wired to mirror each other's states unconsciously. The tone of your voice, the tension in your body, the rhythm of your breathing, all of it seeps into others and pulls their emotions into alignment with yours, often before they realize it. This is influence not through words, but through atmosphere. When you radiate confidence and excitement, people around you feel uplifted and energized, compelled to move with your momentum. When you project calm in chaos, others instinctively settle, taking their cues from your composure. But when you release anger, panic, or despair, those emotions infect like poison, clouding judgment and amplifying fear. Emotional contagion bypasses logic completely. It doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it simply overwhelms the nervous system of those nearby, dragging them into your emotional current. This weapon is everywhere. Leaders use it to rally crowds, turning a room electric with passion or heavy with solemnity. Manipulators use it to destabilize, flooding an environment with negativity until others shrink and submit. Even in relationships, one partner's moods can dominate the others, chaining them to emotional highs and lows that are not their own. The danger of emotional contagion is its invisibility. People rarely realize their feelings are being hijacked. They assume the emotions are theirs, not borrowed. And once inside, those emotions shape thoughts, decisions, and behaviors. To master emotional contagion is to become the thermostat in every room, setting the emotional temperature while everyone else simply adjusts. Confidence projection. Confidence projection is a psychological weapon that commands belief, respect, and compliance, not because of proof, but because of presence. Humans are wired to follow certainty, and when someone radiates unshakable confidence, others instinctively assume they must know what they're doing. The brilliance of this weapon lies in its illusion. Confidence doesn't require truth, skill, or authority. It only requires the ability to project it so convincingly that no one dares question it. When you walk into a room with steady posture, unwavering tone, and controlled movements, people's subconscious interprets you as a leader. In negotiations, a calm, confident statement delivered without hesitation carries more weight than pages of evidence. In arguments, the one who projects certainty while the other scrambles or doubts themselves is the one who wins, even if they are wrong. Confidence shifts the balance of power because it creates an emotional reality that overrides logic. This weapon is especially potent because doubt is contagious, but so is conviction. A person who acts as though success is inevitable pulls others into their frame of belief. Followers rally behind them, skeptics hesitate to challenge them, and even opponents begin to second-guess themselves. Confidence projection doesn't just influence perception, it infects it, making people align their behavior with the strength they perceive. Manipulators exploit this ruthlessly. Con artists project confidence to lure victims into schemes. Toxic leaders project certainty to silence dissent. Yet, the effect is the same. The crowd believes not because of facts, but because of how powerfully those facts are delivered. Confidence projection proves that in the battlefield of influence, certainty often defeats truth. Selective memory recall. Selective memory recall is a psychological weapon that distorts reality by choosing which fragments of the past to highlight and which to bury. It is the deliberate act of pulling certain memories into the spotlight while leaving others in the dark, shaping perception, not through lies but through careful editing of truth. The human mind is fragile when it comes to memory. It craves coherence, even if that coherence is manufactured. When someone recalls only the parts that suit their narrative, they rewrite reality itself. In arguments, selective memory recall is merciless. A manipulator will remind you of every mistake you ever made, every flaw, every moment of weakness, while conveniently forgetting their own. They twist the past into a weapon, forcing you to defend yourself against a distorted timeline. Soon you begin questioning your own recollections, doubting your innocence, wondering if maybe they are right and you are wrong. In relationships, this tactic becomes emotional blackmail. A partner may remember every time you disappointed them, while erasing every sacrifice you made. They weaponize memory like a ledger, stacking guilt on your side while leaving theirs blank. You find yourself apologizing, explaining, or overcompensating, trying to balance a scale that was rigged from the start. Even in politics or leadership, selective recall manipulates masses by glorifying certain victories while erasing failures, or by magnifying past dangers while silencing progress. Leaders control not just the present, but the lens through which the past is seen. The devastating power of selective memory recall is that it doesn't require invention. It doesn't need lies. It uses reality itself, just not all of it. And in the gaps between what's remembered and what's forgotten, truth is lost and control is gained.